Hey there, history lovers. Tonight we're rewinding the clock 1,000 years to a world where one single thing decided your entire life before you could even walk, where you happened to be born. Not how smart you were, not how hard you worked, just the patch of dirt your mother was standing on. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where the universe handed you a script at birth and said, "Good luck, no edits allowed." Picture four people under the very same sky. A serf bent over a muddy field, a merchant strutting through town like he owns the place, a monk copying books by candlelight, and a knight lounging in a stone castle, deciding whether to go hunting or just intimidate the neighbours for fun. Same century, same country, four completely different planets. And here's the kicker. Roughly 8 out of 10 people back then were peasants, yet the history books always blab on about the other two. Tonight we flip that script. 4 worlds, those who worked, those who prayed, those who fought, and the ones on top. And we're getting specific. The food, the freedom, the justice, and how long you'd actually live. Before we dive in, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from right now. Alright, let's roll. So if your entire fate hung on where you were born, the obvious question is who decided that the dirt under your feet mattered more than the brain inside your skull? And the answer is that nobody decided it on purpose exactly. Instead, the people of the Middle Ages inherited a tidy little theory about how the world was supposed to work, dusted it off, and treated it as though it had been handed down directly from the heavens along with the weather and the harvest. They called it the Three Estates, and it is the single most useful map you can carry through this entire story, because every person we're about to meet spent their life standing somewhere on it, whether they liked their spot or not. Here is the theory in its purest form, the version a medieval bishop would have explained to you with great patience, and absolutely no sense that anything about it was odd. Society was divided into 3 great groups, each with its own job, each utterly dependent on the other two. The first group was the orators, the ones who pray. These were the churchmen, the monks and priests and bishops, and their job, taken extremely seriously, was to handle the spiritual paperwork for everyone else. Souls were in constant danger, the afterlife was a real estate market with very high stakes, and somebody had to be on the phone with the management at all hours. That was the clergy. The second group was the bellators, the ones who fight. These were the knights and lords and the whole armoured upper crust, and their job was to defend the land and the people on it from anyone who fancied taking it. The third group, and by far the largest, was the laboratories, the ones who work. These were the peasants, the farmers, the overwhelming majority of every human being alive, and their job was beautifully simple and crushingly endless. They fed everybody. And then, perched above all 3 estates like a referee who also owns the stadium, sat the king. The king's position was the genuinely tricky one, because he did not neatly belong to any single estate, and yet was bound up with all of them. In one sense, he was the greatest of the fighters, the supreme warlord, the man every armoured noble ultimately owed service to. In another sense, he stood apart and above, anointed in a ceremony heavy with sacred oil and solemn ritual that the church performed, which meant his authority was wrapped in a holy blessing the praying estate alone could provide. He was, in a way, the keystone of the arch, the single piece at the top that pressed down on everything else and held the whole structure from flying apart. Take any other stone out of an arch and you weaken it. Take out the keystone and the whole thing collapses at once. The king was meant to be that, the point at which all the obligations and loyalties finally converged, the man to whom, in the end, everyone owed something, and who, in theory, owed protection and justice back down to all. Whether real kings lived up to that lovely picture is a question we will be revisiting with a fair amount of skepticism, but the picture itself mattered, because it told everyone that the structure had a single guarantor at the summit, and that to defy the order was, at the very top, to defy a man whose power came wrapped in the language of heaven itself. Now, if you are listening to this and thinking that sounds suspiciously convenient for the people at the top, congratulations, you have already understood more about the Middle Ages than the theory wanted anyone to understand. Because the 3 estates was never just a sociologist sketching a population pie chart. It was an idea with a job to do, and that job was to make the whole arrangement feel natural, eternal, and frankly the only sensible way things could possibly be. It was ideology dressed up as common sense, which, unsurprisingly, is the most effective kind. The clever part, the part you have to admire even while raising an eyebrow, is the way every estate justified its existence through service to the others. The peasant did not simply work the fields because the lord would make his life miserable otherwise, though that was certainly true. No, the peasant worked because feeding the kingdom was his sacred contribution, his role in the grand machine. The knight did not merely lounge around in a fortified house collecting other people's grain. He protected the realm, shed blood so that the farmer could plant in peace, and that protection was supposedly worth every sack of wheat that came his way. The churchman did not just enjoy a warm room and a steady supply of food while others froze in the mud. He prayed, ceaselessly, for the souls of everyone, which in a world utterly convinced of heaven and the alternative was arguably the most important work of all. Everyone served everyone. The pyramid held hands. It was in theory a gorgeous system of mutual obligation, a society where every single person mattered because every single person carried a load that the others could not. In theory. In practice, of course, the load was not exactly distributed with a spirit lab balance and a steady hand. The man who prayed and the man who fought both did their service from inside a warm building, while the man who worked did his service knee-deep in a cold field, and somehow the cold field always came with a much shorter life and a much smaller dinner. But the genius of the idea was that it gave the cold field a meaning. You were not just suffering. You were holding up your corner of God's own architecture. Take that away and you are simply a tired person standing in mud, which is a far harder thing to make peace with. Let us put some actual shape on this pyramid, because the proportions are the whole point and they are genuinely startling. Imagine the entire population of medieval Europe as a single crowded room. The vast, sweating, overwhelming majority of that room, somewhere in the neighbourhood of 8 out of every 10 people, were rural labourers, peasants, the ones who worked. Pull back from any village, any town, any cathedral, and the landscape was a sea of these people tending fields, minding animals, and producing the food that kept literally everything else upright. Then, in a much thinner band, you had the townsfolk, the merchants and craftspeople, and the guild members we will get to in glorious detail later. These were the people who lived behind town walls and made their living from trade and skill rather than soil, and they were a minority. An interesting and increasingly powerful minority, but a minority all the same. Thinner still was the clergy, that whole praying estate from the humble village priest right up to the cardinals, and then, at the very tip, so small you could practically count them, sat the nobility. The lords, the great families, the people whose names we actually remember because they were the ones who could afford to be remembered. The men who fought, in the formal sense of the word, and the men who ruled. So when those history textbooks devote chapter after chapter to kings and knights and bishops, just keep that crowded room in mind. They are lavishing attention on the back 2 rows while ignoring the 80% standing right at the front. Naturally, those at the front left fewer written records, which is exactly why we have to work so hard to hear them at all. Here is the question that should be itching at you by now. If this system was so spectacularly unbalanced, if 8 out of 10 people were doing the back-breaking work while a tiny sliver at the top enjoyed the comfort, why on earth did it last for centuries? Why did the people at the front of that crowded room not simply outnumber and overwhelm everyone behind them, given that they could have done so on any given Tuesday? The answer is the thing that makes the 3 estates so durable and so quietly sinister, and it comes down to a single idea, the one we will return to again and again across this whole story. Dependence. The system held together not because anyone was happy with it, but because each estate genuinely needed the others, or at least believed it did, and pulling one piece out threatened to bring the entire structure crashing down on everybody's head, including the people doing the pulling. Think it through from inside the mind of a medieval peasant. Yes, the lord took a frankly outrageous share of what you grew, but the lord also, in theory, kept the bandits away, settled disputes, and stood between your village and the kind of roaming chaos that made life genuinely unsurvivable. Remove the lord and you did not get freedom and a bigger dinner. You got a defenceless village and the very real prospect of someone worse, riding in to take everything. The clergy may have lived comfortably off tithes you could barely afford, but they also held the keys, as everyone firmly believed, to the only thing that mattered more than this life, which was the next one. Burn that bridge and you were not just poor, you were damned. And the nobility, however much they squeezed, were the ones with the weapons, the training and the castles, which made the prospect of simply telling them no a very short-term plan with a very predictable ending. So everyone clung to their place, partly out of belief, partly out of fear, and partly because the alternative was a terrifying blank. The estates were like three people standing on each other's shoulders at the edge of a cliff. Nobody's comfortable, the man on the bottom is doing all the actual work, but the moment anyone steps away, the whole tower goes over the edge together. Stability through mutual hostage-taking, if you want to be unkind about it, and there is really no other way to be. And now we arrive at the word that sits at the dead centre of this entire construction, the load-bearing beam holding up the whole medieval house, and it is not a word people tend to associate with the romance of knights and cathedrals. The word is unfreedom. Because for the system to work, for that enormous labouring base to stay put and keep producing, an enormous number of people had to be, in a very literal and legal sense, not free to leave, not free to choose their work, not free to decide where to live or whom to serve. The pyramid did not just rest on the labour of the many, it rested on their inability to walk away from that labour. Hold on to that idea, because we are about to climb down off the theory and into the actual lives of the people at the bottom, and unfreedom is going to follow us into every single field we visit. Let us start by clearing up a misunderstanding so common it has practically fossilised. When you hear the word peasant, your brain almost certainly serves up an image of a ragged, starving, hopeless figure. Basically a synonym for a poor person, the lowest of the low. This is wrong, and it is wrong in a way that matters, because it makes us pity these people in a lazy way instead of actually understanding them. A peasant was not, by definition, poor. A peasant was a person who worked the land for a living. That is the whole definition. It described what you did and how you fit into society, not the size of your savings. There were peasants who scraped by on the edge of disaster, certainly, but there were also peasants who were comfortable, even prosperous by the standards of their world, with livestock and surplus grain, and a respected name in the village. We will meet one of those families later, and we will watch with a kind of horror as everything they have built quietly comes apart. But the point for now is simple. Peasant meant farmer. It did not mean failure. What defined the peasant's life far more than wealth was the question of freedom. And this is where we have to talk about serfdom, which is one of those words everyone has heard and almost nobody can actually explain. A serf was a particular kind of peasant, and a great many peasants were serfs, especially in the earlier centuries we are concerned with. The serf was, in plain terms, unfree. He lived on a plot of land, his holding, and that plot was not his. It belonged to the lord, and the serf held it in exchange for labour, for working the lord's own fields a set number of days, for handing over a share of his harvest, and for a whole menu of other dues and obligations that the lord's officials tracked with a thoroughness that would make a modern accountant weep with envy. And the defining feature, the thing that made a serf rather than just a tenant who paid rent, was that he could not simply leave. He was bound to that land. He could not pack up, decide the village down the road looked nicer, and move there to seek his fortune. His feet, legally speaking, were planted in that soil as firmly as the crops. Now, your modern instincts are screaming that this is a nightmare, and in a great many ways it absolutely was. But here is where the Middle Ages does that thing it does so often, where it takes a situation that looks purely awful and reveals a logic underneath that is genuinely strange and genuinely two-sided. Because the binding ran in both directions, the serf could not leave the land, yes. But, and this is the part that catches everyone off guard, the lord could not simply throw the serf off the land either. The holding was not something the lord could revoke on a whim because he was in a foul mood or wanted to bring in someone he liked better. The serf had a recognised customary right to his plot. It was his to work, and crucially, it was his to pass on. When a serf died, his holding did not vanish back into the lord's pocket. It went to his heir, to his son, and then to his son's son, generation after generation, the same family on the same strips of earth, for a span of time that would make most modern property arrangements look like a weekend rental. It is worth pausing on what those obligations actually looked like up close, because the word dues makes it sound like a tidy monthly bill, and it was nothing of the sort. The serf owed labour first and foremost, the famous week work, a set number of days every week spent toiling not on his own strips, but on the lord's land, the part of the estate the lord kept for himself. At the busiest, most desperate moments of the farming year, the harvest above all, the serf owed extra days on top, the boon work, which arrived with the cheerful inevitability of the lord needing the most help at the exact moment the serf most needed to be tending his own crops. On top of the labour came payments in kind, a share of the grain, eggs at certain seasons, perhaps a hen at one festival, and a portion of the slaughter at another, and then came the smaller fees, the ones that reveal just how thoroughly the lord's reach extended into the corners of a person's life. There was a fee to grind your grain, because you were generally required to use the lord's mill rather than a simple hand mill at home, and the miller, who took his cut on the lord's behalf, was just about the least popular man in any village for reasons that need no explanation. There was a payment when a daughter married, especially if she married outside the manor, since the lord was effectively losing a future worker and expected to be compensated for the inconvenience of someone falling in love. And there was the death duty, which meant that when a serf died, his family typically owed the lord the best animal in their possession, often the single most valuable thing the household had, handed over at the precise moment the family could least afford to lose it. Death, in other words, came with an invoice. So pause on the genuinely odd shape of this. The unfreedom came bundled with a kind of security. You could not leave, but you also could not be cast out. You were stuck, but you were stuck somewhere that was, in a meaningful sense, permanently yours. In a world with no insurance, no safety net, and a tendency to swing between feast and famine on the whim of the rain, that permanence was not nothing. It was, in fact, a great deal. A free man who lost his land had lost everything, and could starve in a ditch with his liberty fully intact. A serf who fell on hard times still had his holding, still had the strips his grandfather had ploughed, still had a roof and a place in the village. The chains, in other words, also functioned as an anchor in a storm, and for a lot of people the trade was one they would have been afraid to give up even if someone had offered. This is the paradox you have to hold in your head to understand these people honestly. Their lack of freedom and their measure of protection were not two separate facts. They were the same fact, viewed from two angles. The very thing that trapped them also, in its grim way, looked after them. It is not a comfortable idea. It is not supposed to be. But let us not get carried away and start romanticizing it either, because there was an aspect of serfdom that strips away any temptation to find it cozy, and it is this. The serfs did not just come with the land in some abstract sense. They came with it in a brutally concrete one. When a lord inherited a manor, when an estate passed from a father to a son, or changed hands through marriage or grant, the new lord did not merely inherit the fields and the mill and the buildings, he inherited the people. The serfs living on that manor were counted, recorded and transferred along with the livestock and the timber and the fish ponds, as part of the value of the property. They were assets. A manor was worth more if it had a healthy population of able-bodied workers bound to it, in exactly the way a farm is worth more with good soil. The human beings on the estate were, in the cold language of the records, very nearly a kind of possession, listed and valued and handed down. They were not slaves in the ancient sense. They had rights and customs that protected them in ways a slave never had, but they were also unmistakably not free, and the line between a person who comes with the property and a thing that comes with the property was, in the paperwork, uncomfortably thin. Which brings us naturally to the figure looming over every serf's life, the one who held the land and therefore held the people, the lord, the landlord, to use the word that has aged into something far smaller and more mundane than it once meant. Who actually were these landlords? The easy assumption is that they were all nobility, the great armoured families from the top of our pyramid, and a lot of them certainly were. But the reality was more varied and more interesting than that. Sometimes the lord of a manor was indeed a knight or a baron or a member of a famous house. But sometimes the person holding land and collecting dues was not noble at all. Sometimes it was a prosperous free peasant, a man who had done well, accumulated holdings, and risen to a position where he too had tenants beneath him. A reminder that the line between the labouring estate and the people who profited from labour was not always as sharp as the neat theory pretended. And then there was the landlord who owned more land, collected more dues, and held more people in bondage than perhaps any individual noble family in the entire realm. The single largest landlord across much of medieval Europe was not a family at all. It was the church. The same praying estate, the oratores, those gentle men devoted to the next world, were collectively among the most formidable property owners in this one. Monasteries and abbeys and bishoprics held vast tracts of the best land, complete with mills and markets, and of course, the serfs bound to all of it. The monks who had supposedly renounced the world were sitting, as an institution, on an enormous slice of it, and the peasants on church land owed their labour and their harvest to the abbey just as surely as any peasant owed his to a baron. All of this, the dues and the labour and the careful counting, ran through a single institution that organised the entire bottom of the pyramid, and it deserves a proper introduction because we'll keep bumping into it. The manor. A manor was the basic unit of rural life, an estate with its lord, its fields, its mill, its church often enough, and its bound population, all functioning as one economic and legal world. And the manor ran on a surprisingly elaborate little machine of officials, most of whom were peasants themselves, which is one of the quietly fascinating details of the whole arrangement. The lord rarely managed his land in person, particularly if he held several estates scattered across the country, so he appointed a steward to oversee them all, and beneath the steward sat the bailiff who handled a single manor, and beneath the bailiff remarkably sat the reeve, who was very often a serf elected by his fellow villagers to organise the labour and keep the accounts. So you had the genuinely strange spectacle of an unfree man supervising the unfree work of his unfree neighbours on behalf of a lord, and somehow being trusted by everyone involved to keep it more or less straight. It was self-administration of a sort, the village partly running itself within the cage the lord had built. And running through the heart of the manor was its court, which is the source of so much of what we actually know about these people. The manor court was where disputes were settled, where dues were recorded, where a man was fined for letting his pig wander into a neighbour's barley, or for brewing weak ale, or for failing to turn up for his labour days. It met regularly, it kept rolls, and those rolls are the closest thing we have to a diary of the medieval village, a long and gloriously petty record of who owed what to whom, and who was caught doing what to whose livestock. The lord profited from the fines, naturally, so justice and revenue were comfortably married, but the court was also where village custom was upheld, where a serf could, occasionally, win a point against the powerful by appealing to the way things had always been done. Custom was a real force, and even the lord trod carefully around it, because a manor where the customary balance was shattered was a manor that might stop functioning altogether. We should also be clear that the labouring estate was not one undifferentiated lump, because lumping everyone together is exactly the lazy habit we are trying to break. Among the peasants there were real and meaningful gradations. At the more comfortable end sat the substantial holders, the men with a full holding of land, enough strips to feed a family well, and even produce a surplus to sell. Below them were the smaller holders, working half a holding or less, closer to the edge but still landed. And below them again were the cottagers, the people with just a cottage and a tiny scrap of garden, far too little to live on, who survived by hiring out their labour to their better-off neighbours and to the lord. So even within the village, even among people the theory filed under the single heading of those who work, there was a whole ladder of relative wealth and relative misery, with families perched on every rung, some climbing, some slipping, and cutting across all of it was the line between bound and free, because not every peasant was a serf. Some held their land as free tenants, paying rent in money rather than owing labour and bondage, free to leave if they chose, and the gap between a prosperous free tenant and an unfree serf on the very next strip of land could be the most important fact in either man's life. There was even, famously, a route out of bondage for the desperate or the daring, because by custom, a serf who fled to a chartered town and managed to live there unclaimed for a year and a day became free. The town air, as the old saying had it, making a man free. Easier said than done, of course, since a determined lord could come looking, but the route existed, a narrow crack of light in an otherwise sealed wall. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment, because it sets up a tension that is going to run hot through the rest of this story. Picture a peasant family living on land owned by a great abbey. They work, they pay, they hand over their share of the grain year after year, generation after generation. Their sweat literally builds and maintains the abbey, keeps its walls standing, fills its storerooms, funds its beautiful stonework and its quiet candlelit rooms, and yet that peasant family will never in their entire lives set foot inside that abbey as anything other than a labourer at the gate. The serene world behind those walls, the warmth, the food, the books, the safety, the very thing their labour pays for is a world they are not permitted to enter. They build the comfort. They do not get to feel it. That, right there, is a peculiar and bitter kind of arrangement. You spend your life paying for a luxury you're forbidden to touch, run by men who have officially given up worldly comfort and yet seem to be doing remarkably well. And you do it because the system, the map, the whole three estates theory, tells you this is your sacred role, and questioning it is questioning God's own design. For a very long time, an astonishing length of time really, most people accepted exactly that, They worked, they paid, they prayed at the gate, and they believed. But resentment is a patient thing. It does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly in the gap between what people are told the system is and what they can plainly see it actually is. The gap between you are an essential and honoured part of God's plan, and you will never be allowed inside the building you paid for. That gap is small at first, easy to ignore, easy to explain away, but it widens generation by generation, dew by dew, harvest by harvest, until one day it is wide enough for something to fall through. The unfreedom that anchored people in the storm could also, given the right pressure and the right spark, become the exact thing they were no longer willing to carry. We are going to follow that gap. We are going to watch it widen across the chapters to come, through the surprising prosperity of good years and the catastrophe of bad ones, through the rise and ruin of individual families whose names survive by sheer accident in dusty court records, until it reaches the moment it finally tears wide open and the people at the front of that crowded room decide all at once that they have served their corner of the pyramid long enough. The fuse is laid. For now it is only smouldering, buried under centuries of custom and belief, and the genuine fear of what might happen if the tower at the edge of the cliff ever came down. Before we get there, though, we have to understand something that the lazy version of this history gets spectacularly wrong, the same way it gets the meaning of peasant wrong. The assumption is that the medieval countryside was a place of changeless, hopeless drudgery, 1,000 years of people scratching at the dirt with sticks while nothing whatsoever improved. That picture is not just unkind. It is, as we are about to see, almost the exact opposite of the truth. Because the very system we have just mapped out, the unfree majority bound to the soil, was sitting on top of a wave of genuine transformative change. The people we have just been pitying were, without most of them ever knowing it, living through one of the most remarkable bursts of practical innovation that Europe had ever seen. And it started, of all places, with the dirt itself, with the tools that turned it, and with a clever piece of leather and wood that would quietly reshape the entire continent. But to appreciate just how much was about to change, we first need to be honest about what we are looking at when we picture this world, and to resist the urge to flatten it into a single grey story of misery. The crowded room was not a static photograph. It was a living thing, full of people who married and argued and brewed beer and cheated each other and went to court over a strayed pig with exactly the energy and pettiness you would expect of human beings in any century. They were not a faceless mass of the oppressed, patiently waiting for history to happen to them. They were the engine of the entire society, and the society knew it, even if it would never have admitted that the engine deserved a bigger share of what it produced. And the records, when we are lucky enough to have them, prove it. Because here is the thing about a system that treats people as part of the property. It writes them down. It counts them. It values them. It drags them into court when they owe 5 shillings. It notes when they brew ale for sale, and when they fail to show up for their Labour Days, and when their daughter marries the smith's son 2 villages over. The same bureaucratic instinct that reduced a serf to a line item in a manor's inventory also, by accident, preserved the faint outline of his existence for us to find centuries later. The Lord's obsession with knowing exactly what he owned is, ironically, the reason we can say anything at all about the 80% the textbooks ignore. We have to read these people through the eyes of the men who counted them, which is a frustrating and partial way to meet anyone, but it is what we have, and it is far more than nothing. What makes the medieval world endlessly fascinating rather than simply depressing is how alive it was underneath that rigid frame. The theory said everyone had a fixed place and stayed in it, serving quietly until death. The reality was messier, more mobile, and far more human than the theory could ever allow. Free peasants did rise. Serfs occasionally bought or won their freedom. Townsmen grew rich enough to lend money to kings. The pyramid was supposed to be carved in stone, and yet it was always, quietly, shifting beneath the surface, with individuals scrambling up and tumbling down its sides while the official story insisted that nobody moved at all. The map and the territory never quite matched, and the space between them is exactly where all the interesting history lives. That gap between the official story and the lived reality is going to be our guide. The 3 estates told everyone that the working majority existed to serve, that their unfreedom was natural, that the abbey they could never enter, and the lord who counted them like cattle, were simply the way of things, ordained and unquestionable. And for centuries the people at the bottom mostly went along with it, not because they were stupid or content, but because the alternative was a frightening unknown, and the system, for all its cruelty, did offer that strange anchor of security in exchange for the chains. But going along with something is not the same as believing in it forever. The fuse we have laid was real. The resentment was real. The gap was widening, and the conditions that would eventually light that fuse, the slow build of prosperity followed by the sudden shock of disaster, were already, quietly, beginning to take shape in the fields of that supposedly changeless countryside. Which is precisely where we are headed next, down into the soil itself, to meet the ploughs and the horses and the deceptively simple inventions that were about to make the entire system richer, more populous, and ironically, far more fragile than anyone bound to that land could possibly have foreseen. The first thing to throw out before we go anywhere near a plough is the image that the word medieval probably plants in your mind the moment you hear it. 1,000 years of nothing. A dark, frozen pause between the cleverness of the Romans and the cleverness of everyone who came afterward, during which Europe apparently forgot how to do anything except suffer and pray. It is one of the most stubborn ideas in all of popular history, and it is almost entirely backwards. The truth is that the centuries we're talking about saw a burst of practical ground-level innovation so significant that it outstripped anything Rome had managed, and it did so in the one area that mattered more than any other, to a society where 8 out of 10 people farmed for a living. It transformed how food was grown. The Middle Ages were not a long nap. They were, in the countryside at least, a slow and quietly spectacular revolution, and the funny thing is that almost nobody living through it would have thought of it as revolutionary at all. They were just trying to get more out of the dirt. They simply happened to be extraordinarily good at it. To understand what changed, you first have to picture how the land was actually laid out, because it looks nothing like the neat fenced fields of a modern farm, each one belonging to a single owner who does whatever he likes with it. The medieval village mostly used what is called the open field system, and the name is wonderfully literal. The arable land around the village was not divided into separate enclosed farms. It was open, one great expanse, but cut up into a patchwork of long thin strips, and these strips were shared out among the village households. Your holding was not a tidy square in one corner. It was a scattered collection of strips dotted all over the open fields, a few here, a few there, deliberately spread around so that everyone got a fair mix of the good soil and the bad, the well-drained and the soggy, the conveniently close and the annoyingly far. It was an elaborate exercise in collective fairness, which sounds lovely until you realise it also meant that to tend your own land, you had to walk back and forth across the whole landscape, and that your strips sat cheek by jowl with your neighbours, with no fences between them, which gave people a truly inexhaustible supply of reasons to quarrel about whose furrow had wandered onto whose. These long strips even had a name, the Celian, and their distinctive shape, long and narrow with a gentle reverse curve, was not an accident or an aesthetic choice. It was dictated by the plough team and the sheer effort of turning it around. You laid the strip out long so that you spent as much time as possible ploughing forward in a straight line, and as little as possible wrestling a team of heavy animals through an awkward turn at the end. The shape of the medieval field, the very contour of the land that in some places survives in the soil to this day, was essentially a record of how hard it was to make a plough change direction. Beyond the arable strips lay the other shared elements that made the village a functioning whole. There was the common pasture, the grazing land that no single household owned but everyone could use to feed their animals, governed by careful custom about how many beasts each family could put out so that the grass was not stripped bare. There was the meadow, prized above almost everything, because it produced the hay that kept livestock alive through the winter, and a village with good meadow was a village that did not have to slaughter half its animals every autumn simply because it could not feed them. And there were the ponds, including the ponds that powered the mill, that same Lord's Mill we have already met, which sat at the centre of the village economy like a toll booth on a road everyone was required to use. The whole arrangement was a tightly woven web of shared resources and shared rules, a community that had to cooperate to survive whether its members happened to like one another or not, which, human nature being what it is, they frequently did not. Now we come to the genuinely clever part, the innovation that quietly doubled the productivity of the land without anyone inventing a single machine. The problem with farming, the eternal problem, is that growing crops drains the soil. Plant the same hungry crop in the same field year after year, and the land simply gives up, exhausted, yielding less and less until it produces almost nothing. The ancient solution, the one the Romans used, was to split your land in two and only ever farm half of it at a time. One half you planted, the other half you left fallow doing nothing, resting and recovering, and the next year you swapped them. It worked, but it was wildly inefficient, because at any given moment fully half of all your precious farmland was sitting there producing absolutely nothing, like keeping half your factory permanently switched off so it does not wear out. The medieval improvement on this was the three-field system, and it is one of those ideas that sounds almost too simple to matter, and yet quietly changed the population of a continent. Instead of dividing the land in two, you divided it in three. In any given year, one field grew a crop planted in autumn, typically a hungry grain like wheat or rye that demanded a lot from the soil. A second field grew a crop planted in spring, something like barley or oats, and crucially also crops like peas, beans and vetch. And the third field lay fallow, resting exactly as before. Then everything rotated, the fallow field took the autumn grain, the autumn field took the spring crops, and so on around the cycle. The brilliant trick hiding inside this was the spring planting of peas and beans, because although nobody at the time understood the chemistry, those plants quietly put goodness back into the soil rather than draining it. The legumes were doing the work of restoring the very fertility that the grain had stripped out, replenishing the nitrogen that crops crave, which meant the land recovered faster and could be worked harder. Tally up what that change actually did. Under the old two-field method, half your land was idle every year. Under the three-field method, only a third sat idle, which meant 2/3 of your land was producing food at any moment instead of one half. That alone was an enormous jump. But on top of that, you are now growing peas and beans, which fed people directly, fed the livestock and improved the soil all at the same time, a rare example of getting three useful things from one decision. More land in use, better soil, more variety, and a hedge against disaster, because if your grain harvest failed, you still had your legumes, and if the spring planting failed, you still had the autumn one. It was risk management and productivity boost rolled into a single elegant rearrangement of the calendar, and it was achieved with no new tools whatsoever, just a smarter way of using the year. But there were new tools, and the most important of them was a beast of a thing that the Romans, for all their roads and aqueducts and engineering genius, never properly developed, because their soil never forced them to. It was the heavy plough. To understand why it mattered so much, you have to think about dirt, specifically about the difference between the light, dry, crumbly soils of the Mediterranean world and the heavy, wet, clay-rich soils of northern Europe. The Romans farmed the light stuff, and for light soil a simple plough is fine, a tool that basically scratches a shallow groove in the surface, which is all that loose Mediterranean earth requires. Drag that same scratch plough across the dense, sticky clay of the north, and it does almost nothing useful, sliding over the top of soil that needs to be properly broken open and turned. That heavy northern clay was, for the simpler tools, very nearly unfarmable, which is one of the unglamorous reasons large swaths of fertile Europe sat underused for so long. The heavy plough solved this with brute mechanical cunning. It was a far more substantial machine, equipped with a knife to cut down into the soil, a blade to slice it horizontally, and most importantly a curved board that lifted the cut earth and rolled it right over, turning the heavy clay clean upside down, burying the weeds, aerating the soil, and creating those raised ridges and furrows that helped the perpetually rain-soaked northern fields drain. Suddenly, the rich, deep, heavy soils that had defeated lighter tools became some of the most productive farmland in the world. The catch, naturally, was that turning over thick clay is enormously hard work, and the heavy plough was not a tool one person could simply push along. It required a large team of strong animals to drag it, and a team like that was expensive, often beyond the means of a single household, which is part of why those scattered strips and that culture of cooperation existed in the first place. People pooled their animals and shared the plough team because almost nobody could afford to do it alone. The technology that opened up the land also forced the community to work together to use it. The plough team was not the only place the age learned to harness power beyond human muscle either, and the mill we keep mentioning deserves a closer look, because it was far more than a place to grind flour. Water power was one of the great quiet workhorses of the medieval economy. A well-sited watermill turning steadily on a diverted stream or a purpose-built pond did the labour of dozens of people without tiring, without eating, and without complaining, which already made it the envy of every overworked household, And the medieval mind, having figured out how to capture the force of moving water, was not content to stop at grinding grain. Mills were adapted to all sorts of heavy, repetitive tasks, and one of the most important was the fulling of cloth, the laborious process of pounding and cleansing woven wool to thicken it and tighten its weave into proper weatherproof fabric. This had traditionally been done by people stamping on the cloth in troughs with their bare feet for hours, which was exactly as tedious and unpleasant as it sounds. The fulling mill replaced those aching feet with water-driven wooden hammers that pounded the cloth automatically, dramatically speeding up one of the key stages of cloth production and feeding directly into the booming trade we will come to shortly. Where water was scarce or unreliable, the age reached for the wind instead, and the windmill, with its great turning sails, spread across the breezy, flatter regions as another way to grind grain without a single human arm being raised. Power, in other words, was being mechanized, captured from rivers and breezes and put to work, in a society that supposedly had no interest in such things. Which brings us to my personal favourite piece of medieval ingenuity, a humble invention so unassuming that it sounds like a joke and yet reshaped the entire rural economy: the horse collar. Now, the obvious animal to pull that heavy plough team was the ox, and oxen did the job for centuries. Oxen are strong, they are patient, they are cheap to feed because they will happily eat rough grass that would leave a horse hungry, and they are powerful enough to drag the heaviest plough through the stickiest clay. Their one flaw, and it is a significant one, is that they are spectacularly, almost comically slow. An ox plods. Watching an ox work is an exercise in patience that would test a saint. So why not just use horses, which are considerably faster, and would let you cover far more ground in a day? Here is the genuinely strange answer, and it explains why something as small as a redesigned harness deserves its place in history. For a very long time, you could not effectively use a horse to pull a heavy load, because of the way horses were harnessed. The old style of harness, inherited from antiquity, looped a strap across the animal's throat and chest. On a light cart that was fine, but the moment the horse leaned its full strength into pulling something genuinely heavy, that strap pressed directly against its windpipe and the great vessels of its neck, so that the harder the horse pulled, the more it throttled itself. The animal was essentially choking itself the instant it tried to do real work, which put a hard and rather alarming ceiling on how much a horse could haul. The horse had the speed and the energy, but its own equipment was strangling it. The horse collar fixed this with one beautifully simple change. Instead of a strap across the throat, it was a rigid padded collar that sat on the horse's shoulders, transferring the entire load to the powerful muscle and bone of the shoulders and the chest, well away from the windpipe. The horse could now throw its full strength into pulling without slowly suffocating itself, and the difference was transformative. A horse fitted with a proper collar could pull as hard as it needed to, which meant the faster animal could finally take over from the plodding ox. And a horse, for all that it is fussier and more expensive to feed, works considerably quicker, which meant a farmer could plough more land in the same number of hours, turn the soil at the critical moments before the weather changed, and squeeze more productivity out of every working day. A small loop of padded leather and wood, the kind of thing you would walk straight past in a museum, quietly handed medieval agriculture a substantial upgrade in speed. It is one of the great lessons of history that the inventions which change the world are very often not the dramatic ones, but the deeply, almost insultingly mundane ones. And the medieval appetite for squeezing more food out of the landscape did not stop at improving the fields that already existed. People went looking for new land entirely, in places that everyone had previously written off as worthless. Across the low, waterlogged stretches of Europe lay great expanses of marsh and bog, the kind of soggy, reed-choked, half-drowned ground that produced nothing but wildfowl and misery and the occasional drowned sheep. To the medieval farmer eyeing a growing population and a hunger for more arable land, that wasted wetness started to look less like an obstacle and more like an opportunity, provided you could only get the water out of the way. So they did. With a patience and persistence that is genuinely impressive, communities undertook the long, grinding work of draining the wetlands, digging networks of ditches and channels to carry the standing water away, building banks and embankments to hold back the floods, and constructing raised causeways across the soft ground so that people and animals could actually cross what had been impassable bog. Whole regions that had been good for nothing but the occasional eel were gradually converted into rich, fertile farmland, and the drained marsh, full of accumulated organic matter, often turned out to be some of the most productive soil of all. a reward for all that mud-caked effort. It was a colossal, unglamorous, multi-generational engineering project, carried out largely by the very labouring people the textbooks ignore, and it permanently reshaped the map. Land that had been a liability became an asset, and the area available for growing food expanded accordingly. So step back and add it all together, because the cumulative effect is the whole point. A smarter rotation that kept 2/3 of the land working and quietly restored its fertility. A heavy plough that unlocked the rich soils the ancient world could not touch. A redesigned harness that let faster animals do the work, and an aggressive campaign to drain the marshes and create farmland out of swamp. Stack these on top of one another, and what you get is a steady, sustained rise in the amount of food the land could produce. And in any pre-modern society, the equation that follows is brutally simple and entirely reliable. More food means more surviving children. More surviving children means more people, and more people means a growing, expanding, increasingly busy world. The population of Europe swelled dramatically across these centuries. Villages grew, new ones were founded on freshly cleared and drained land, and the whole rural engine hummed along at a level of output that would have astonished a Roman farmer. And there was a second, subtler consequence of all that surplus food, one that quietly reshaped society. When the land produces more than the people working it need to eat, it means that not everyone has to farm anymore. A surplus of food is, in effect, a surplus of human time, and that freed up time is what allowed a growing number of people to step away from the soil altogether and make their living some other way. As craftsmen and traders and specialists clustered in the growing towns, the full and the prosperous countryside was, without quite realizing it, feeding the rise of the town, and the merchants and guildsmen we'll meet later owed their very existence to the peasant who grew more grain than his own family could swallow. The supposedly stagnant Middle Ages were, in fact, feeding more mouths than the continent had ever managed before. Hold on to that surge of growth and abundance, because it is the high watermark, the good times, and good times in this story have a way of not lasting. Now all this extra food and all these extra people lead us to a point that bears repeating, because it cuts against the lazy stereotype so directly. A peasant was not automatically a starving wretch. We established that the word describes a job rather than a bank balance, and the agricultural boom meant that for a good long stretch, a fair number of these working families did considerably better than merely survive. There were genuinely prosperous peasants, households with surplus grain to sell, livestock to spare, a bit of money put by, and a comfortable standing in the village. Farming, in the good years, could be a path not just to subsistence, but to a modest, real prosperity, an understanding that is essential to understanding the shock of what happens when the good years end. You cannot appreciate a fall without first acknowledging there was something to fall from. So what were these people actually growing across their 3 rotating fields? The staples were grains, the foundation of every meal and the heart of the rural economy. Wheat was the prestige crop, the one that made the fine white bread the wealthy preferred, but it was demanding and did not always thrive. So for many ordinary households, the more reliable workhorses were barley, oats, and rye. Barley was endlessly useful, not least because it was the foundation of ale, which we'll get to in a moment and which mattered enormously. Oats fed both people and horses, particularly those hard-working collared horses we just met, which needed proper fuel for their labour. Rye made the dark, dense bread that filled the bellies of the majority. And alongside the grains came those soil-restoring legumes, the peas and the beans and the vetch, the last of which was grown largely as fodder, a nitrogen-rich feed to keep the livestock going. It was a varied, sensible, resilient mix, a diet and an economy built on grain and supplemented by everything else the careful rotation allowed. But growing food to eat is one thing. The real question, the one that separated the comfortable from the merely surviving, was what you could grow or make to sell, because cash, even in a world that ran heavily on barter and labour and dues, was the thing that let a family climb. And here the medieval economy had one absolute superstar of a product, a commodity so valuable and so central that it shaped trade routes, enriched whole regions, and built fortunes that would have been unimaginable to the people producing it. Wool. It is easy to underrate wool from our modern vantage point, surrounded as we are by an infinite supply of cheap fabric, but in this world wool was close to miraculous, and it earned every bit of its reputation. It was warm, obviously, but more than that, it was warm even when wet, which in the damp, drizzly, perpetually overcast climate of northern Europe was not a minor convenience but a genuine matter of staying alive. A wet wool garment still insulates, still holds your body heat, in a way that many other fibres simply do not, and in a place where being cold and wet was the default condition for much of the year, a fibre that kept working in the rain was something close to a wonder material. Wool clothed nearly everyone, from the roughest peasant cloak to the finest noble gown, and the demand for it was effectively bottomless. That demand turned wool into one of the great engines of wealth of the entire age. Raising sheep for their fleece became enormously profitable, and the regions blessed with good grazing land grew rich on the backs, quite literally, of their flocks. The raw wool was sheared, sorted and sold, and then it travelled, because the places that produced the best wool were not always the places best at turning it into finished cloth. This created long, lucrative trade routes carrying raw wool out to the great weaving centres and finished cloth back again, threading across seas and through ports and along rivers, with merchants taking their cut at every stage. The wool and cloth trade was international, sophisticated, and staggeringly valuable, and it tied distant corners of the continent together in a web of commerce that moved fortunes. A huge share of that commerce flowed through the trading networks of the northern seas, the great merchant association that linked the ports of the North Sea and the Baltic into one sprawling commercial web, moving wool, cloth, grain, timber, fish, and just about everything else between dozens of cities. These northern merchants maintained trading bases in the major ports they dealt with, and in London they operated from a walled riverside compound of their own, a self-contained little enclave of warehouses and counting houses known as the Steel Yard, where foreign traders lived and worked under their own rules, importing and exporting on a scale that made them a serious commercial power. For an ambitious wool producer or cloth merchant plugged into these networks, the opportunities were real, and the word getting rich is not an exaggeration. This was a trade on which genuine fortunes were built, where a family that understood the routes, the markets, and the timing could rise from comfortable to wealthy, and eventually to powerful. The humble sheep, in other words, was a ladder, and a surprising number of people climbed it. Not all trade happened on that grand international scale, of course, and it is worth remembering how the ordinary surplus actually turned into money for an ordinary family, because long-distance commerce in wool was the spectacular end of a much more everyday system. The humble engine of local exchange was the market, the weekly gathering where the surrounding villages brought their spare grain, eggs, ale, cheese, livestock, and cloth to sell and to buy what they could not make themselves. A town with the right to hold a market held something genuinely valuable, because markets drew people, and people brought money, and the lord who controlled the market took his tolls on the trade. Above the weekly market sat the fair, a much bigger and rarer event, held perhaps once a year and lasting days, drawing merchants and goods from far afield, a combination of trading bonanza and social spectacle that could transform a sleepy town for a week and leave it richer afterward. It was through this layered system, the local market feeding into the regional fair feeding into the great international routes, that a prosperous peasant's surplus wool or a widow's spare ale could begin a journey that, link by link, connected the smallest cottage to the merchant compounds of the great ports. The medieval economy was a chain, and even the lowest link was part of something that reached across the sea. Not all the making and selling happened in distant cities, though. A great deal of productive work took place right inside the ordinary rural household, in the home itself, and this gives us one of those satisfying moments where a word we still use turns out to come straight from this world. Cottage industry. The term means exactly what it says. It refers to manufacturing carried out not in a factory or a workshop, but in the cottage, in the domestic home, by the family living there, fitted in around all the other endless tasks of running a household and working the land. Two activities in particular defined this home-based production, and both were absolutely central to village life. The first was brewing. Ale was not a luxury or an indulgence in this world. It was a dietary staple, consumed by nearly everyone, including children, in quantities that would alarm a modern doctor, and for a very practical reason. The water was often unsafe, and the mild, freshly brewed ale of the period, weak by modern standards and drunk young, was a far safer source of daily fluid and a meaningful source of calories besides. Households brewed it constantly, from that barley we mentioned, and any family that brewed more than it needed could sell the surplus to its neighbours, turning a basic domestic chore into a small but real income. The second great cottage activity was the working of that miracle fibre, the spinning of wool into thread and the weaving of thread into cloth, done at home on simple equipment, transforming raw fleece into something with real value, either for the family's own use or, increasingly for sale into that vast and hungry cloth trade. And here we arrive at a detail that the traditional history with its kings and knights and bishops has spent centuries quietly skating past, and it is one we're going to circle back to with real attention before this whole story's over. Both of these crucial home industries, the brewing and the cloth making, the two great engines of the cottage economy, were overwhelmingly the work of women. It was women who brewed the ale that the village drank and sold the surplus that brought in extra money. It was women who spun the thread, hour upon patient hour, so reliably and so universally that the very word for an unmarried woman, the spinster, comes from this work. Cloth and ale, two of the most economically important products the ordinary household produced, rested squarely on female labour, and this work, let us be clear, was not instead of everything else these women did. It was on top of it. A woman of the labouring estate worked the fields alongside the men, raised the children, ran the household, cooked, cleaned, tended the animals, managed the garden, and then, in whatever hours remained, brewed the ale and spun the thread and wove the cloth that helped keep the family solvent. It was, in the plainest terms, a relentless second shift layered over an already exhausting first one, an enormous and largely invisible contribution to the household economy that the records, written by men and concerned with men's obligations, mostly failed to count or credit. The prosperity of a peasant family, the surplus that let it climb rather than merely survive, frequently depended on the unrecorded, untiring labour of its women, and the official story of the age has remarkably little to say about it. We are flagging this now, gently, because it threads through everything that follows, and because we will be returning to it deliberately at the very end, gathering up the women of every estate, from the peasant brewer to the merchant's wife keeping the accounts to the noblewoman, married off to seal an alliance, to ask what their lives actually looked like in a world that mostly forgot to write them down. For the moment, simply file it away. The cottage economy that helped lift the fortunate peasant family above bare survival was powered in large part by women carrying a double load, and the apparent prosperity of these decades was built on far more shoulders than the chronicles ever bothered to acknowledge. So this, then, is the medieval countryside at its high point, and it is a far cry from the grey, static misery of the stereotype. It is a landscape of clever rotations and turned clay and faster horses, of drained marshes becoming gold, of grain in the fields and sheep on the hills, of ale brewing in the cottage and cloth heading off to distant ports along the great trade routes, of ordinary families building modest fortunes on wool and labour and ingenuity. It is a world that had figured out how to make the land yield more than ever before, and had grown rich and populous on the strength of it. It is, in short, the good times, the abundant, expanding, surprisingly dynamic peak of the rural medieval world, which is precisely the moment to remember an uncomfortable truth that hangs over the entire arrangement. All of this prosperity, every bit of it, depended on one thing staying reliable, and it was the one thing no plough or harness or trade route could control: the weather. The whole gleaming structure of medieval abundance, the rotations and the harvests and the swelling population, rested on the assumption that the seasons would keep behaving, that the rains would come when wanted and stop when not, that the summers would be warm enough and long enough to ripen the grain. For a long and fortunate stretch, they did exactly that, and the good times rolled. But the climate of the Middle Ages was about to do something that no peasant, however clever, and no lord, however powerful, could plough or trade or pray their way out of, and when it turned, it would reveal just how thin the margin between abundance and catastrophe really was. The same fields that had fed a growing continent were about to teach everyone living on them a brutal lesson about who, in the end, actually held the power, and it was never the king. For all the cleverness we have just been admiring, the rotations and the ploughs and the drained marshes and the trade routes spun out of sheep. There was one force in this world that no peasant could outwit and no lord could command, one power that sat above the king and the pope and the entire three estates without ever asking permission: the weather. We tend to treat climate as scenery, a backdrop to the real action of history, kings and battles and intrigues happening in the foreground, while the seasons quietly turn behind them. For the medieval world, that gets it exactly the wrong way around. The seasons were not the backdrop. They were the main event, the single greatest power in everyone's life, and the rise and fall of the entire rural world we have been describing tracks the rise and fall of the temperature with a precision that should make us a little nervous. Here is the thing that made all that prosperity possible, the unspoken foundation under the ploughs and the harvests. For roughly 4 centuries, from about the year 900 to around 1300, Europe enjoyed a stretch of unusually kind weather, a long and generous warm spell that historians call the medieval warm period. It was not dramatic, no tropical heat waves or palm trees in the north, just a modest, sustained shift toward milder conditions, and that modesty is precisely what makes it so easy to overlook and so important to understand. The winters were a little gentler, the summers ran a little longer and a little warmer. And, most crucially of all, the growing season, that precious window between the last frost of spring and the first frost of autumn, when crops can actually ripen, stretched out by just enough to make an enormous difference. A few extra weeks of warmth at each end of the year does not sound like much, but to a farmer it is the difference between a grain that ripens fully and one that does not, between a reliable harvest and a gamble, between a field that can be planted at all and one that sits too cold and too short of summer to bother. Those few gentle degrees were, quietly, the engine behind everything in the previous chapter. The longer growing season meant more reliable harvests. More reliable harvests meant more food. More food, as we have established, meant more surviving people, and the confidence to break new ground, to push cultivation up hillsides and into the north, and onto the freshly drained marshes that the warmer, more cooperative weather suddenly made worthwhile. The whole expansion of the medieval world, the swelling villages, the new settlements, the rising population, was riding on the back of a climate that happened, for a few lucky centuries, to be on humanity's side. Nobody planned it, nobody earned it, and nobody, crucially, understood that it could end. They simply built their entire civilization on the assumption that the weather they had always known would be the weather they always would know, which is the kind of assumption that feels perfectly reasonable right up until the moment it betrays you. We can actually watch this warm, confident world in the art it left behind, and it is one of the loveliest pieces of accidental evidence in all of history. Medieval manuscripts, particularly the beautiful illustrated prayer books made for the wealthy, often included a sequence of small paintings called the Labours of the Months, one little scene for each month of the year showing the agricultural work appropriate to that season. It was essentially a calendar told through farming, a visual almanac of the rural year. January and February for the cold, quiet tasks, the pruning and the feasting through what winter there was. The spring months for ploughing and sowing, the high summer for the great drama of the harvest, the mowing and the reaping, and the late autumn and early winter months for the slaughter, the gathering in, the preparation for the lean season ahead. What is fascinating, almost eerie, is what these scenes show and what they do not, depending on when they were painted. In the manuscripts from the heart of that warm period, the depictions of the year's end are revealing. You see December scenes of peasants slaughtering pigs, the great annual cull of animals that could not be fed through winter, and you see them baking bread and feasting. But look closely at the ground, at the trees, at the sky. There is no snow. The December of the warm centuries, as the artists themselves recorded it, was a brown, muddy, workable affair. Cold, certainly, but not the white frozen wasteland we picture. The painters were not making it up or being lazy. They were painting the world they knew, and the world they knew, even in deep December, was simply not all that snowy. And then, with a slowness that makes it tragic, the pictures begin to change, because the kind weather did not last. Sometime in the decades around the start of the 14th century, the climate of Europe began to turn, sliding out of that long warm spell and into a colder, harsher, far less forgiving era that would persist, on and off, for centuries, a period grim enough to have earned the name the Little Ice Age. The shift was not a single dramatic event, but a creeping deterioration. The winters lengthening and biting harder, the summers cooling and shortening, the growing season contracting back in on itself, squeezing shut the very window that had made the good times possible, and once again, the art records it without meaning to. Move forward into the manuscripts of the colder centuries, and look again at those December scenes, at the same agricultural calendar, the same slaughtering and baking. Now there is snow. It lies on the ground, it caps the rooftops, it hangs in the bare branches. The artists, still simply painting the world in front of them, were now painting a world where December meant white, because in their lifetimes it suddenly did. You can read the descent into a colder age in the gradual creeping of snow into pictures that, a century or two earlier, had none. History written, quite literally, in the changing weather of paintings. The paintings are charming evidence, but they are far from the only trace the great cooling left behind, and the other clues are just as eloquent once you know to look for them. Consider the vineyards. During the warm centuries, the climate had been generous enough that grapes for wine could be grown surprisingly far north, in regions that today would regard the very idea as a joke, including respectable vineyards across the south of England. Wine was being pressed from English grapes in places where, a few generations later, no sensible person would have tried. As the cold crept in and the summers shortened, those northern vineyards withered and were abandoned one by one, the grape retreating southward like a thermometer falling, until the notion of English wine became the historical curiosity it remained for centuries afterward. The map of where you could grow a vine was, in effect, a slow-motion record of the temperature dropping. Further north still, the evidence turned starker and sadder. Out on the very edge of the medieval world, in the windswept settlements the Norse had established on the coasts of Greenland during the warmth of those earlier centuries, the cooling was not an inconvenience but a death sentence. Those communities had taken root when the climate was mild enough to make farming and herding on that harsh frontier just barely possible. As the centuries cooled, the sea ice crept further and lingered longer. The growing season collapsed. The ships from home came less often through increasingly choked waters, and slowly, over generations, those isolated outposts dwindled and failed, and finally vanished altogether, a whole branch of European settlement quietly extinguished by a few degrees of cold. And in the mountains, the glaciers, which had retreated and shrunk during the warm spell, began to grind forward again, advancing down the valleys and in some places swallowing pastures, and even buildings that had stood on ground people had farmed for generations. The same modest shift in temperature that had once let a continent expand was now, everywhere you cared to look, quietly forcing it to contract. For a society balanced so precariously on the reliability of the harvest, this cooling was not a matter of needing a warmer cloak. It was an existential threat, and it announced itself with horrifying force in the second decade of the 14th century, in an event that gave the continent a brutal preview of just how fragile its abundance had always been: the Great Famine. It began, as agricultural disasters so often do, with rain. Not a dramatic flood, but something almost worse, a relentless soaking year after year wetness. In 1315, the rains came and would not stop, drowning the fields, rotting the seed in the waterlogged ground, ruining the hay so the animals starved, and washing away the harvest that the whole population depended on to live. A single bad year is survivable. Communities had reserves, had stored grain, had ways to scrape through one failed harvest by tightening their belts and praying for the next. But the rains came again in 1316, and the second failed harvest fell on a population that had already exhausted its reserves surviving the first. The result was catastrophe on a scale that is genuinely hard to absorb. Across vast stretches of northern Europe, the food simply ran out. Grain prices soared beyond anything ordinary people could pay. The stored seed grain was eaten in desperation, which meant even when the weather eventually improved there was less to plant. People weakened, sickened, and died in enormous numbers across the whole continent. Not in some distant corner, but everywhere the rains had fallen, a slow, grinding mass mortality that emptied villages and broke families over the course of 2 or 3 terrible years. It was not a localized misfortune. It was a continent-wide demonstration that the swelling, confident, prosperous world of the warm centuries had been living much closer to the edge than anyone wanted to believe, and that a mere shift in the rainfall could push millions straight over it. And the misery did not end when the rains finally relented, because the famine had a vicious sequel that piled disaster upon disaster. In the years immediately following the worst of the hunger, a devastating sickness swept through the cattle of Europe, a livestock plague that killed oxen and other animals in staggering numbers right across the same regions the famine had already gutted. The timing could hardly have been crueler. A population that had just spent years starving, that had eaten its reserves and weakened its bodies, now watched its draft animals, the very beasts that pulled the heavy ploughs and made farming possible at all, die off in droves. Lose your oxen, and you cannot properly work your land, which means the recovery that should have followed the return of better weather was crippled before it could begin. Fields went unploughed for want of animals to pull the plough. Families that had clung through the hunger now lost the means of production itself, and the whole grinding cycle of shortage dragged on long after the skies had cleared. The catastrophe of these years was never a single blow. It was a cascade, the cold leading to the failed harvests to the famine to weakened bodies, and the weakened world to a livestock plague that kicked the survivors while they were down. Now here is a detail that takes us right back to the structure we mapped at the very beginning, the pyramid of estates, because the famine did not fall on everyone equally, and understanding why illuminates the whole brutal logic of the system. The famine hit the ordinary peasant far harder than it hit the great institutions like the wealthy monasteries, and the reason comes down to a single concept that we would today call diversification of risk. Think about the position of a large abbey, one of those vast clerical landlords we have already met. Its wealth did not rest on a single field. It rested on dues and rents drawn from hundreds of tenants, spread across many manors, often scattered across different regions with different soils and slightly different weather. If the harvest failed catastrophically in one place, the abbey still had its rents from a dozen other places. Its risk was spread out, smeared thin across a huge and varied base, so that no single disaster could wipe it out. A monastery could absorb a terrible year the way a wealthy modern institution absorbs a bad quarter, with pain perhaps, but with survival essentially assured. Now think about the peasant. The peasant had one patch of land. His entire survival, his family's entire existence, rested on the few acres he worked, on that single small bet placed on that single small piece of ground. If his harvest failed, there was no other field somewhere else to fall back on, no spread of risk, no diversified portfolio. There was only the empty granary and the hungry children and the long cold months until a harvest that might or might not come. The same disaster that the abbey shrugged off as a difficult year could annihilate the peasant household entirely. The concentration of all his hopes on one fragile spot, which in good years had simply been the normal way of things, became in bad years a death sentence. The structure that we described as offering the serf a kind of security, the anchor of his permanent holding, turned out to offer no security at all against the one enemy it could not negotiate with. The land was his, yes, but when the land gave nothing, his having it meant only that he had nowhere else to turn. And as if the cooling climate and the great famine had not made the point with sufficient brutality, the worst was still to come, waiting just over the horizon, because a generation after the rains drowned the harvests, something far deadlier began to make its way toward Europe along the very trade routes that had once carried such prosperity. The Black Death. We will not dwell on it at length here, for it deserves its own telling, but it arrived in England in 1348, and it is impossible to talk about the fate of the medieval world without naming the shadow it cast. A population already shaken by famine, already living closer to the edge than it knew, was about to meet a mortality so vast it would reshape society from the bottom up, hollowing out the very labouring base that held the whole pyramid aloft. The good times of the warm centuries did not simply fade. They were ended decisively and horribly, first by the weather and then by the pestilence that followed in its weakened wake. This is the larger truth this chapter exists to drive home. The prosperity we admired was never as solid as it looked. It was a gift of the climate, enjoyed by people who mistook good fortune for permanence, and when the climate withdrew the gift, the whole edifice proved astonishingly fragile. The greatest power in the medieval world was not the man wearing the crown. It was the temperature, the rainfall, the length of the summer, the forces that no army could fight and no decree could command, and they giveth, and they taketh away, with a sublime indifference to the human arrangements built on top of them. But statistics about continent-wide mortality, however staggering, have a way of sliding off the mind. Millions is a number, not a person, and it is hard to truly feel a number. So to understand what this fragility actually meant, what it looked like at the scale of a single family, standing on a single patch of vulnerable ground, it helps to follow one household down into the records and watch, in the dry language of the manor court, exactly how a prosperous medieval family could come apart. And remarkably, we can do this, because that obsessive medieval habit of writing people down, of recording every debt and due and petty quarrel, occasionally preserves enough scattered traces of an ordinary life that we can reassemble its rough shape across the decades, like reading a story told only through receipts. Let us follow a man we will call Henry Marsh, a peasant of the late 13th century, because his story, pieced together from the kind of records that survive, is the famine and the fragility made personal. In the 1270s, Henry Marsh was, by the standards of his world, a man doing genuinely well. He was no cottager scraping by on a garden plot. He held something in the region of 15 acres, roughly half of what was called a vergate, a substantial holding by village standards, the kind of land base that could comfortably feed a family and generate a real surplus. He had livestock. He kept geese, which he fattened and sold off at Christmas, exactly the sort of small commercial sideline that marked a household with its head above water, and his wife, in the time-honoured fashion of the cottage economy, brewed ale for sale, bringing in that additional woman-powered stream of income that so often made the difference between getting by and getting ahead. By any reasonable measure, the Marsh household was a success story, a family that had used the good years and the productive land to build something solid. We know just how solidly Henry stood in his community because of the role the records show him playing, and it is a telling one. He acted as a pledge, a surety, for his neighbours. In the workings of the village and its court, a person in debt or facing an obligation often needed someone respected and creditworthy to formally vouch for them, to stand as guarantor that the obligation would be met. You did not ask just anyone to do this. You asked someone whose word and whose assets carried weight, someone the community trusted to be good for it. Henry Marsh was repeatedly that man, the one his neighbours turned to when they needed someone reliable to stand behind them. It is a small detail, but it speaks volumes. He was not merely comfortable, he was trusted, established, a pillar of his little world, the kind of man you would have bet on staying secure for generations, and then he vanishes. For roughly a decade, across the 1280s and into the early 1290s, Henry Marsh simply drops out of the surviving records, a frustrating silence of the kind that haunts anyone trying to reconstruct ordinary medieval lives. We do not know what happened in those years, only that when the curtain lifts again and Henry reappears in the documents, everything has changed, and not for the better. It is worth lingering on that silence rather than rushing past it, because the gap itself is part of the story. A decade vanished from the record might hide any number of quiet calamities: the death of valuable animals, a string of poor harvests on his particular fields, an illness that kept him from his work at a crucial season, a bad bargain, a guarantee for a neighbour that went wrong and dragged him down with it. The records were never a diary of feelings or misfortunes, only a ledger of obligations, so they preserve the outline of a man falling without any of the detail of why, the way you might find a person's bank statements but none of their letters. What we can say is that whatever unfolded in that lost decade was thorough, because the man who emerges on the far side of it is unrecognisable in his circumstances, if not yet in his name. The respected pillar of the community, the man who stood as surety for others, is now himself in serious trouble. He has fallen into debt, real and pressing debt, the kind he cannot climb out of. The specific moment the records capture is almost painfully mundane, which is exactly what makes it so devastating. A man named Walter of Aldgate takes Henry to court over a debt of 5 shillings. 5 shillings. Not a fortune even by the modest standards of village life, the sort of sum the old prosperous Henry would have settled without a second thought. But the Henry who now faces Walter in court cannot pay it. He is so far gone that to deal with this relatively small debt, he has had to mortgage his entire harvest, pledging away the very crops in his fields, the food and income of the coming year, just to cover what he owes. A man who once guaranteed other people's debts is now unable to find 5 shillings without gambling away everything he has left to grow. The fall from surety to debtor could hardly be starker, and it happened, whatever the details hidden in that decade of silence, with frightening speed. What comes next reveals one of the cruelest features of the unfree peasant's position, the trap built into serfdom itself. Henry, desperate, needs to raise money, and the obvious asset is his land, those valuable acres that had once been the foundation of his prosperity. But Henry is a serf, and a serf does not truly own his land in the way a free man does. He cannot simply sell it on an open market to the highest bidder. As an unfree tenant, the land is held of his lord, and he can only dispose of it back to that lord, in this case the abbey that held the manor. He is a seller with exactly one permitted buyer, which is, as anyone who has ever tried to sell something to the only person allowed to buy it can imagine, not a position that gets you a good price. The abbey, holding all the power in this transaction, gives him only around £2 for land that represented the labour of a lifetime and the security of his entire family. He is forced to sell low to the one buyer the law allows, and the foundation of the household, the land itself, is gone, swallowed back into the abbey's vast holdings for a pittance. There is a quiet, grinding logic to how these great landlords grew, and it is on full display here. The abbey did not need to scheme or steal to accumulate land. It simply had to wait. In good years it took its dues, and in bad years, when its unfree tenants were driven to the wall, it stood ready as the only permitted purchaser of the very land those tenants were desperate to sell, acquiring it cheaply from people who had nowhere else to turn. Misfortune flowed in one direction, and so did the land, drifting steadily from the failing households up into the patient, ever-growing reserves of the institution. The peasant's catastrophe was, in the coldest accounting, the abbey's slow and bloodless gain. With the land sold off for far less than it was worth, the Marsh family, which by now numbered around 9 people, was left clinging to survival by a single thread. And here we come to a detail that matters enormously, and that points forward to a theme we keep flagging. The one piece of land the family had left, the ground they now depended on entirely, was the wife's land, the property she had brought into the marriage as her dowry. And the reason it survived when everything else was lost is itself revealing about the texture of medieval life. A wife's dowry land was, by custom and law, hers, in a way that gave it a measure of protection. It could not simply be seized to pay the husband's debts, or sold off in his desperation. It was in effect ring-fenced, a protected asset that remained with her even as her husband's fortunes collapsed around them. So the family that had been built on Henry's substantial holding, now stripped away, survived only because of the land that had come through his wife, a striking and easily overlooked reminder that women in this world were not the propertyless dependents the simple story imagines, that they could hold and protect real assets, and that sometimes the whole family's survival rested on exactly that protection. But survival is not the same as recovery, and Henry Marsh never recovered. The records show him dying in 1312, still in debt. The slide that began somewhere in that lost decade never reversed. The prosperity of the 1270s never regained. He went into the ground a poorer and more burdened man than he had been in his prime. His story, a complete arc from comfort to ruin, played out over a single lifetime. And the final chapter is the bleakest of all, and it ties his private tragedy directly to the great catastrophe we have just described. After Henry's death, his daughters appear in the records for a little while longer, and then, by around 1319, they too vanish. All of them, gone from the documents entirely. And 1319 is not a neutral date. It sits in the immediate aftermath of the Great Famine, those terrible drowned years of 1315 to 1317, and the hunger and death that trailed behind them. We cannot know for certain what became of the Marsh daughters. Perhaps they married and moved away to manors whose records we do not have. Perhaps they left to seek their fortunes elsewhere, and simply slipped beyond the reach of the writing. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility that hangs heavily over the whole story, they were among the countless ordinary people the famine swallowed, dying unremarked in those years of rain and hunger, their disappearance from the records being the only trace their deaths ever left. That is the entire point of following this one family so closely. The Marshes were not the wretched poor of the lazy stereotype. They were a success, a prosperous, respected, well-established household at the upper end of village society, exactly the kind of family that the good warm centuries had allowed to flourish. And within the span of a single generation, less really, they went from a man trusted to guarantee his neighbours' debts, to a family scattered, and very possibly dead, their land swallowed by the abbey, their name fading out of the record entirely. No war destroyed them, no dramatic villain, no single great disaster you could point to. Just debt, and the trap of serfdom, and the merciless arithmetic of a peasant household carrying all its risk on one patch of ground, and finally looming over the end the weather and the famine it brought. A medieval family could rise on the good years and then come apart, completely and permanently, in the space of about 10 of the bad ones. And that fragility, multiplied across the millions of ordinary households living on their single fragile patches of ground, is what the swing from warm abundance to cold catastrophe actually meant. Not an abstract dip in a temperature chart, but Henry Marsh selling his land to the abbey for £2, and his daughters disappearing into the silence after the rains. The great forces of climate and famine that we describe from a height are made, on the ground, entirely of stories like his repeated endlessly, the vast majority of them never written down at all. We happen to be able to glimpse the marshes only because of a handful of surviving court entries, a debt here, a pledge there, a sale recorded for the Abbey's accounts. For every family we can faintly trace, there were countless others who rose and fell and vanished without leaving even that much, their entire existence erased as completely as if they had never ploughed a furrow or brewed a barrel of ale. There is one more thread worth pulling from all this before we move on, because it connects the cold and the hunger to something that has been quietly building under this entire story: resentment. Picture the position of a family like the Marshes in those grinding years, watching their own fortunes collapse while the abbey that held their manor weathered the same disasters with barely a stumble. They sold their land to that abbey for a fraction of its worth because they had no other buyer. They had spent their lives paying their dues to it, their labour and their grain helping to fill the very storehouses that now let it ride out the famine in relative safety. The same storehouses they themselves could not draw upon. The institution that absorbed the hard years with ease was, in part, cushioned by generations of exactly their kind of labour, and yet when those labourers went hungry, the comfort their work had built was not theirs to share. The unfairness of it, the sheer galling spectacle of the rich institution surviving comfortably on a thinly spread risk, while the people who fed it starved on their concentrated one, did not pass unnoticed by the people living it. It accumulated quietly in the same widening gap we identified earlier, the gap between what the system claimed to be and what it plainly was. That accumulated bitterness, fed by famine and plague, and the daily evidence of an arrangement rigged against the people doing all the work, was building towards something. The patient resentment of generations does not stay patient forever. The same labouring majority that had carried the pyramid for so long, that had built the abbeys and fed the lords and accepted its place at the bottom, because the system offered that strange anchor of security, was learning, through the hard decades of cold and hunger and the hollowing toll of pestilence, that the anchor had been a lie all along. And when a people who have been told their suffering is sacred finally stop believing it, when they look at the comfortable and the safe and begin to ask out loud by what right the arrangement is so unequal, the fuse that has been smouldering for generations is very close indeed to catching fire. That fire, when it came, would put the great unwashed labouring majority on the road to London, with weapons in their hands and a startling new idea in their heads. The idea that perhaps the men at the bottom of the pyramid were not put there by God at all. The fuse we have been watching smoulder for the better part of this story finally caught in the summer of 1381, and to understand why it caught precisely then, we have to pick up the thread left dangling at the end of the last chapter, the strange new arithmetic that the great pestilence had left behind. Recall that when so vast a portion of the labouring population had died, the survivors discovered something genuinely revolutionary. Though no one called it that at the time, their labour had become scarce, and scarce things, as any merchant could have told them, command a higher price. For the first time in living memory, the men and women at the bottom of the pyramid found themselves in a position to bargain, to demand better wages, to walk away from a stingy lord and find a more generous one down the road who was desperate for hands. It was a small taste of leverage, and after centuries of being told their place was fixed by God, it must have tasted extraordinary. The people at the top, predictably, did not care for this development one bit. The whole comfortable arrangement depended on cheap, abundant, immovable labour, and here was labour suddenly making demands, and worse, getting them. So the response of the ruling classes was the response of ruling classes throughout history, when the natural order starts tilting in the wrong direction. They tried to make it illegal. Laws were passed attempting to freeze wages at their old, pre-plague levels, to forbid labourers from leaving their masters or demanding more, to pretend by royal decree that the catastrophe had not happened, and that everyone should kindly go back to working for the same pittance as before. It was an attempt to legislate away the basic law of supply and demand, which works about as well as you would expect, and it accomplished little except to inform the labouring classes, in the clearest possible terms, that the people in charge regarded their newfound leverage as a problem to be crushed rather than a fact to be accepted. The resentment we have been tracking, already fed by famine and plague and generations of inequity, now had a fresh and very specific grievance. The lords were not merely taking too much, they were rigging the law to keep taking it. And then came the tax, the particular spark that turned simmering anger into open flame. The crown, perpetually short of money thanks to the eternal medieval hobby of expensive warfare, hit upon the idea of a poll tax, a tax levied not on land or wealth but on heads, a flat sum demanded from nearly every adult regardless of whether they were a wealthy merchant or a struggling labourer. This is, of course, a spectacularly unfair way to raise money, since the same fixed sum that a rich man pays without noticing is a crushing burden on a poor one, and when this poll tax was demanded not once but repeatedly, each time at a heavier rate, it landed on exactly the people least able to bear it. To make matters worse, when collection fell short, as it inevitably did because vast numbers of ordinary people simply could not or would not pay, the government sent out commissioners to chase down the missing money, and these officials descended on the villages with all the warmth and tact of a debt collector who works on commission. The combination of an unjust tax, an aggressive collection, and a population already boiling with grievance was, in retrospect, a recipe for exactly what followed. It is almost as if squeezing desperate people while telling them their suffering is divinely ordained has consequences. What erupted in 1381 was the largest popular uprising England had ever seen, an explosion of the labouring majority that had spent centuries holding up the pyramid in silence and had now all at once decided to stop. It is usually called the Peasants' Revolt, though that name undersells it, because it swept up not only field labourers but craftsmen, villagers of every description, even some of the lesser clergy and townsfolk, a broad coalition of the ordinary against the powerful. It began in the southeast and spread with astonishing speed, and what is most striking about it, what separates it from a simple riot or a tax protest, is how quickly it grew teeth and ideas. And it was not confined to London either, which is worth stressing because the capital tends to hog the story. The rising flared up across a wide swathe of the country, in town and countryside alike, with local risings settling local scores and pressing local demands. In some places the people turned on the great monastic landlords, those vast clerical estates we have met before, demanding the charters of freedom the monks had long denied them, and seizing the abbey precincts they had spent generations paying for and never being allowed to enter. In the eastern counties the revolt took on a life of its own, with its own leaders and its own targets. This was not one mob in one city, but a broad, simultaneous eruption across much of the kingdom, which is part of what made it so terrifying to the authorities, and part of why it counts as something far larger than a London disturbance. What is more, the rising showed a degree of coordination that sits awkwardly with the lazy image of a mindless rabble. Messages passed between the risings in different regions. There were watchwords and rallying cries, a sense of common cause linking people who had never met across counties that rarely acted together. The various columns converging on the capital did so with something resembling a plan. None of this was a modern political organisation, of course, with committees and printed manifestos, but it was a great deal more than spontaneous chaos, and it suggests that the ideas and grievances driving the revolt had been circulating and ripening among the common people for far longer than the sudden explosion of 1381 might imply. The anger did not appear overnight. It had been organising itself quietly in conversations and sermons and shared resentments for years. This was not just an angry mob lashing out. It was, however briefly and however imperfectly, a movement with demands, with leaders, and with a startling vision of how the world might be rearranged. The man whose name has come down to us as the leader of the rising was Wat Tyler, and the most important thing to understand about him is that he was one of the ordinary people, not a disaffected noble or an ambitious churchman looking to climb, but a commoner who emerged from the ranks of the rebels themselves to give the movement a voice and a direction. We know frustratingly little about his life before he stepped onto the stage of history, which is fitting, really, given everything we have said about how thoroughly the records ignored people of his station. He appears almost from nowhere, fully formed as a leader, organising and articulating, and then exits just as abruptly, his entire documented existence compressed into a few extraordinary weeks. But in those weeks, he gave voice to ideas that were genuinely radical for their time, ideas that cut straight at the root of the three estates theory we have been carrying with us this whole journey, because what Tyler and the rebels around him began to articulate was nothing less than a challenge to the idea that some people were simply born to serve and others born to rule. They spoke, in the language available to them, about something we might recognise as universal rights, the notion that the common people possessed dignity and freedom that no lord had granted and no lord could rightfully take away. The peasant, in this dawning vision, was not a tool, not an instrument that existed to pull a plough and fill a granary for the benefit of his betters, but a human being whose labour was his own, and whose servitude was an injustice rather than a sacred duty. After all the centuries we have spent watching the labouring estate accept its place, because the system told them it was God's design, here at last was a voice from within that estate saying, out loud and in front of the king, that perhaps the design was wrong, that perhaps no one had been born to be owned. Standing beside Tyler in spirit and giving the movement its sharpest intellectual edge was a preacher named John Ball, and Ball is one of the most fascinating figures in the whole story, because he provided the theology to match Tyler's politics. Ball was a priest, but a profoundly unconventional one, a man who had spent years wandering and preaching ideas that horrified the church establishment, ideas about equality and the corruption of wealth that had already landed him in trouble more than once. He had a gift for putting radical notions into words ordinary people could grasp and remember, and one phrase attributed to him captures the entire spirit of the Rising in a single elegant stroke. He is said to have preached asking his listeners to consider that in the beginning, when Adam delved the earth and Eve span the thread, who then was the gentleman? It is a deceptively simple question, and it is devastating. In the very beginning he was pointing out, in the world as God first made it, there were no lords and no serfs, no idle nobles and no labouring masses. There was just a man digging and a woman spinning, both working, both equal. The whole towering edifice of rank and privilege, the entire division into those who pray and those who fight and those who toil, was not part of creation at all. It was a human invention, bolted on afterward by the powerful for their own benefit, and what man had made, the line implied, man could unmake. For a society that justified its every inequality as the eternal will of heaven, this was intellectual dynamite, a direct denial that the pyramid had any divine warrant whatsoever. Armed with grievance and these dangerous new ideas, the rebels did the unthinkable. They marched on London. Great columns of them converged on the capital from the surrounding counties, and rather than being stopped at the gates, they got in, helped by sympathisers within the city who shared their anger and threw open the way. Suddenly the largest city in the kingdom was in the hands of the very people the system was built to keep in their place, the labouring multitude pouring through the streets of the seat of power. It was a stunning reversal, the bottom of the pyramid standing however briefly on the top, and here is where the rebels did something that tells you everything about what they actually were, something that separates this rising from common looting and lifts it into the realm of genuine political action. When they reached the Savoy, the magnificent riverside palace that was the grandest private residence in London, belonging to one of the most powerful and detested nobles in the realm, they did not strip it of its treasures and carry off the loot. They destroyed it. They tore the place apart and burned it to the ground, and crucially the accounts tell us they made a deliberate point of not stealing. The story goes that the rebels treated theft from the palace as a betrayal of their cause, that valuables were smashed and thrown into the river rather than pocketed, that a man caught trying to pilfer was dealt with harshly by his own comrades. Think about what that means. A mob that simply wanted to enrich itself would have grabbed everything it could carry. These people instead obliterated the wealth in front of them precisely to prove that enrichment was not the point. They were not after the gold, they were after the message. They wanted to demonstrate that the entire edifice of noble privilege deserved not to be plundered but to be wiped away, that they sought not a bigger share of the old corrupt world but a different world altogether. It was destruction as statement, and it is a far more frightening thing to the powerful than mere theft, because you cannot buy off people who do not want your money. There is a particular target of the rebels' rage that deserves special attention, because it ties this whole rising directly to a theme that has shadowed our entire story: the documents. All through this journey we have noted that obsessive medieval habit of writing people down, of recording every due and obligation and unfree status in careful rolls, and we observed that this very habit is the reason we can glimpse ordinary lives at all. Well, the rebels of 1381 understood the power of those documents far better than any modern observer, and they hated them. Wherever they could reach them, they hunted down and burned the records, the manorial rolls that recorded who owed what labour and which families were bound and unfree, the legal documents and charters and account books that fixed their servitude in writing, and gave it the force of law. To a peasant those parchments were not dry administration. They were the chains themselves, written down, the proof and the instrument of his bondage, and putting them to the torch was an act loaded with meaning. Destroy the record of your unfreedom, and perhaps, in the chaos, the unfreedom itself might be unmade, the lord unable to prove what you owed because the proof had gone up in smoke. It was a strangely sophisticated instinct, an attack not just on persons and palaces, but on the bureaucratic memory that held the whole system in place. Bound up with this was a fierce hatred of the legal class, the lawyers and clerks and royal justices who operated and profited from that machinery of written obligation. These were men who, in the eyes of the labouring people, twisted words and documents to keep the powerful powerful and the bound bound, and the rebels pursued them with particular venom, seeking out anyone associated with the law and its paperwork. It was, in its way, a revolt against the written word as a weapon of the elite, a furious recognition that the ability to read and write and record had been turned into one more tool for keeping the majority in its place. The people who could not write their own names were burning the writings that defined their lives, and there is something both desperate and clear-eyed in that. The rising in the city was not bloodless, it must be said, and a number of officials and others associated with the hated regime met grim ends in those chaotic days, as the fury of decades found targets in the men the rebels held responsible. The violence of those days was real, and we should not prettify it, but neither was it random savagery, for the rebels showed a consistent logic in whom they targeted, striking at the symbols and agents of the system that had ground them down rather than indulging in indiscriminate mayhem. They had demands, they had a sense of justice, however rough, and they wanted them answered by the one person they believed could grant them, the king. Now here is one of the genuine curiosities of the whole affair, a psychological knot worth pausing on. The rebels were not, by and large, against the king himself. Their rage was aimed at the nobles, the corrupt officials, the grasping churchmen, the whole layer of powerful men they saw as standing between them and a just monarch. The king, in their imagination, was almost an ally, a good ruler being badly served by wicked advisers, and if only they could reach him directly and lay their grievances before him, surely he would see the justice of their cause and set things right. It is a touching and rather tragic faith, the belief that the man at the very apex of the pyramid was somehow on the side of the people crushed at its base, and the king they pinned these hopes on was Richard II, who at the time was a boy of just 14, which adds a layer of strangeness to the entire confrontation, a teenage monarch facing down a mass movement that had taken his capital. The young king, to his credit, or at least to his nerve, agreed to meet the rebels, and the first of these meetings took place at a spot outside the walls called Mile End. There, facing the assembled commons, Richard, or those advising him, made sweeping promises. He would abolish serfdom. He would grant the freedoms they demanded. He would issue charters confirming their liberty, pardon the rebels, and address their grievances. It was, the rebels must have felt, a moment of triumph, the king himself conceding the very things their ancestors had not dared even to whisper. Royal clerks were even set to work drawing up the charters of freedom on the spot, and many of the rebels, satisfied that they had won what they came for, began to head home clutching these precious documents, the written proof of their liberation, which is a poignant detail given how recently their comrades had been burning the written proof of their bondage. They had marched on London, and the crown had bent. For a brief, dizzying moment, it looked as though the impossible had happened, and the labouring people had won. But not everyone was satisfied with promises, and the more determined among the rebels, Tyler chief among them, wanted more and trusted less. What they pressed for when they laid out their fuller demands reveals just how far their vision had run beyond a simple complaint about taxes. They wanted serfdom abolished outright and forever, the whole institution of bondage swept away so that no man would be another man's property. They wanted the rents and dues fixed low and fair, the arbitrary power of lords over their tenants broken. They demanded, in some accounts, an end to lordship itself as a layer of power, with no lord standing above the common people except the king alone, a startling flattening of the entire pyramid that would have left only the crown above a single broad community of free men. They wanted the vast wealth of the church redistributed, its enormous land holdings broken up and shared among the people who had laboured to create them, those same abbeys and monastic estates we have watched grow fat on peasant toil. And they wanted equality before the law, an end to the system in which justice bent so reliably toward whoever held rank and money. Whatever one makes of how realistic any of this was, it was unmistakably a program, a coherent if radical blueprint for a wholly different society, and it came not from philosophers in a university, but from labouring people who had supposedly been put on earth only to dig and to obey. That alone makes 1381 extraordinary. The decisive encounter came the following day at a place called Smithfield, just outside the city walls, where Tyler and a body of rebels met the king and his party for further negotiation. And here, in circumstances that remain murky and disputed because the only accounts we have were written by the winners, it all came apart with shocking speed. As Tyler approached and parleyed, presenting the rebels' demands, a confrontation flared between him and the royal party, in particular with the Lord Mayor of London, who was among the king's company. Tempers and tensions that had been wound impossibly tight snapped. In the sudden scuffle, Tyler was struck down, wounded by the mayor and others of the king's men, mortally hurt in the space of a few violent seconds. The leader of the entire rising, the commoner who had given the movement its voice and its direction, was dying on the ground at Smithfield, and with him, in effect, died the rebellion. This is the brutal lesson in how much these movements depended on a single charismatic figure. With Tyler down, the rebels were leaderless, confused, suddenly uncertain, a great crowd that had been a movement moments before and was now just a frightened gathering wondering what had happened and what to do. And the young king, in the most consequential act of his reign, rode forward toward the leaderless rebels and with remarkable coolness for a boy of 14, presented himself as their leader instead, telling them in effect to follow him, that he would be their captain, that all would be well. Whether it was courage or cunning or simply a child improvising in a terrifying moment, it worked. The crowd, robbed of Tyler and unwilling to defy the king they had half worshipped, allowed itself to be led away and dispersed. The moment of danger passed. The rising, deprived of its leader and pacified by royal promises, melted back toward the countryside from which it had come. And then, of course, came the part that anyone who has studied how power behaves could have predicted. The promises were worth precisely nothing. Once the rebels had scattered, once the immediate threat had evaporated and the crown had gathered its forces, every concession Richard had made under duress was swiftly and cynically revoked. The abolition of serfdom, the pardons, the grand freedoms, all of it was declared void, extracted under threat and therefore not binding, which is the sort of legal reasoning that is very convenient when you have an army, and the other side does not. The authorities then set about the grim work of retribution, hunting down those identified as ringleaders, holding trials whose outcomes were never in doubt, and making examples sufficient to remind everyone of the cost of defiance. John Ball, the preacher whose dangerous questions had given the rising its conscience, was among those caught in the net, seized and condemned and put to death for the ideas he had spread, his eloquence repaid in the manner the powerful reserve for those who threatened the order of things. The brief, brilliant flare of the rising was stamped out, and the old order reasserted itself with a vengeance. It is worth placing all this in a wider frame, because England in 1381 was not some lonely exception, a single strange outburst in an otherwise placid Europe. The same pressures that produced the revolt, the upheaval of the great pestilence, the squeezing of a population that had glimpsed its own leverage, the yawning gap between the comfortable few and the labouring many, were at work across the continent, and they produced eruptions elsewhere too. France had seen a furious rising of its rural poor a generation earlier, brutally crushed. The cloth-working towns of Flanders, dense with skilled and increasingly assertive artisans, repeatedly convulsed with revolts against their masters and rulers. Cities in Italy saw their own labouring classes rise and briefly seize a share of power before being put back down. Across the later 14th century, in other words, the bottom of the European pyramid was stirring and heaving in a dozen places at once, as if the whole edifice was settling under a strain it could no longer fully contain. The English Rising was the largest and most dramatic of these spasms, but it was part of a pattern, a continent-wide reminder that the patient endurance of the many had limits, and that those limits were being reached. The attitude of the victors toward the whole episode was captured in a single contemptuous phrase that tradition puts in the young king's mouth, delivered to the defeated commoners in the aftermath. They had been, he is reported to have told them, rustics, low-born labourers, and rustics they would remain, bound and servile with nothing changed and nothing gained. Whether or not Richard actually spoke those exact words, they perfectly expressed the spirit of the reaction, the cold determination of the powerful to slam shut the door the rebels had briefly forced open and to make sure the labouring masses understood that their proper place was exactly where it had always been. You reached above your station, the message ran, and you've been put back in it. The pyramid stood. The men at the top had won. There is a quiet irony worth noting here, though. one that history reserved for the boy king himself. The same Richard II who so coolly faced down the rebels and then so coldly broke his word to them would, less than 2 decades later, find himself deposed by his own nobles, stripped of his crown, and quietly removed from the picture dying a prisoner. The man who told the commoners that their place was fixed and unchangeable discovered in the end that not even a king's place was guaranteed, and that the powerful were perfectly willing to unmake one of their own when it suited them. The pyramid, it turned out, could be merciless even to the figure perched at its very tip, and yet to call it a simple defeat would be to miss something important, because history is rarely so tidy. The poll tax that had triggered the whole disaster was quietly abandoned, the rulers having learned that some ways of squeezing the population were more trouble than they were worth, and the deeper economic forces that had given rise to the leverage in the first place, the labour scarcity, the bargaining power, did not vanish just because a rebellion had been crushed. Over the following generations, slowly and without fanfare, serfdom in England withered away anyway, eroded not by a dramatic revolutionary victory, but by the steady, undeniable pressure of an economy in which labour was simply too valuable to keep in chains. The rebels lost the Battle of 1381 utterly, and yet the world they wanted, or at least the end of the bondage they hated most, gradually arrived regardless, arriving so gradually that it could pretend it had nothing to do with them. The ideas John Ball preached, the dangerous question of who was the gentleman when all men worked, did not die at Smithfield either. They went underground, passed quietly from generation to generation, waiting, as such ideas do, for their time to come round again. But the most telling detail of all, the one that brings this entire story of the labouring majority to its bitter and clarifying point, is not about the revolt itself, but about how it was remembered, or rather how it was not. Here was the largest popular uprising of the age, a movement that had swept up enormous numbers of ordinary people, that had taken London, that had forced a king to negotiate, that had given voice for the first time to ideas about human equality and freedom that would echo for centuries. By any measure, it was one of the most significant events of its century, an episode that spoke directly to the lives and hopes of the 80% of the population we have spent this whole journey trying to see. And for century after century after century, it went essentially unmarked, uncommemorated, unmemorialized, treated by the keepers of official history as an embarrassing eruption of the lower orders best forgotten rather than as the landmark it truly was. The scale of this neglect is genuinely startling when you put a date on it. The first proper memorial to the Rising, a public monument finally acknowledging the event and the people who made it, did not appear until the year 2015. Sit with that for a moment. More than 600 years passed between the rebellion and the moment anyone thought to raise a stone in its memory. 6 centuries of statues to kings and generals and bishops, of monuments to battles and conquests and the deeds of the great, and not one, until the 21st century, to the largest movement of common people the medieval kingdom ever produced. It is the perfect, painful illustration of the theme that has run beneath this entire story like an underground river. History was written by and about the people at the top of the pyramid, the ones who could command a chronicler and afford a tomb, and the vast labouring majority, even when they rose up in their tens of thousands and shook the throne itself, were judged unworthy of remembrance. The men and women who fed the entire civilization, who built the abbeys and the castles, who carried the weight of the world on their backs and who, just once, stood up and said they would carry it no longer, were left out of the story almost entirely, their greatest moment allowed to gather dust for 600 years before anyone decided it mattered. That, in the end, is why we have lingered so long among the people who worked, why we followed a family like the Marshes through their quiet ruin, and why we have insisted again and again on dragging the 80% back into the frame. Because the story as it usually gets told, the story of kings and knights and the glittering few, is not the story of the Middle Ages at all. It is the story of the tip of the pyramid, mistaken for the whole. The real medieval world, the one most people actually lived in, was the world of the labourers, and that world had its prosperity and its catastrophe, its cleverness and its suffering, its long centuries of patient endurance, and its single extraordinary summer of defiance, almost none of which made it into the textbooks. We have to go looking for these people, in court rolls and tax records and the occasional grudging chronicle, precisely because the powerful never built them a monument until our own lifetimes, and even then only one. Having spent so long at the bottom, though, it is time at last to climb. We have seen the world of those who work in all its hard detail, from the strips in the open fields to the smoking ruin of the Savoy. Now we turn to the other estates, the ones the textbooks could not stop talking about, and we begin our ascent with the people who occupied the rungs just above the peasant, the men and women of the towns, the merchants and craftsmen who lived behind the city walls, and who had found a different path entirely, a path that ran not through the soil, but through the marketplace, through the strange and powerful institutions that controlled who could buy and sell and prosper. Because if the countryside ran on land and labour, and the merciless turning of the seasons, the town ran on something else altogether, on trade and privilege and membership in clubs that guarded their secrets jealously, and the gulf between the fate of a peasant and the fate of a townsman is about to become one of the sharpest contrasts in this entire story. If the world of the fields ran on land and weather and the merciless arithmetic of a single fragile harvest, the world we step into now ran on something altogether different, something far closer to what we might recognise as business, and the rules of the game were entirely their own. We have already brushed up against the town once or twice, noting how the surplus of the prosperous countryside freed people from the soil and let them cluster behind city walls to make their living by trade and craft, and noting too that strange old custom by which a serf who escaped to a town and survived there unclaimed for a year and a day could shed his bondage and walk out the other side a free man. Hold on to that idea of freedom, because in the town it took on a very specific and very powerful meaning, and it was the key that unlocked everything. To be free, in the city, was not merely to be unbound. It was to be a member of the club, and the clubs that ran the medieval town were among the most formidable, most jealously guarded and frankly most splendidly self-important institutions of the entire age. They were called guilds. To understand the guild, you have to abandon any modern notion of an open marketplace where anyone with goods and gumption can set up a stall and try their luck. The medieval town was nothing of the kind. It was a tightly controlled commercial fortress, and the guilds were the gatekeepers. A guild was a peculiar hybrid creature, part trade association, part professional brotherhood, part charitable society, part religious club, and, most importantly for our purposes, part monopoly. Each guild controlled a particular trade or craft within the town, and controlled is exactly the word. If you wanted to sell fish, there was a guild for that, and you needed to belong to it. If you wanted to work leather, there was a guild for that too, and outsiders need not apply. If you dealt in gold, in cloth, in spices, in wine, in any of the trades that mattered, there was an organised body of established men who had collectively decided that they, and only they, and the people they chose to admit, would be permitted to do business. Try to sell your wares in the town without the appropriate membership, and you would find yourself shut out, fined, or run off, because the whole point of the guild was to make sure that the profits of a trade stayed in the hands of those already inside it. It was, in the plainest terms, a system designed to limit competition and protect the comfortable, which it did with great efficiency and not the slightest embarrassment, since the people running it saw nothing to be embarrassed about. Now, in fairness, the guilds did not see themselves as grasping cartels, and they would have been deeply offended by the suggestion. In their own eyes they performed genuinely useful functions. They maintained standards, ensuring that the goods sold under their name met a certain quality, so that customers were not endlessly cheated, which in a world without consumer protection was not nothing. They regulated prices and practices to keep the trade orderly. They looked after their own members in times of trouble, supporting the widows and orphans of dead brethren, lending a hand to a member fallen on hard times, providing a kind of mutual insurance in an uninsured world. They funded chapels and feasts and processions, mixing commerce and piety in the comfortable medieval fashion. So there was a real communal and protective spirit to them, a genuine looking after one another. It just happened to come bundled, as so much in this period did, with an iron determination to keep everyone else out and the money in. Charity for the members, a closed door for everybody else. The standards business, in particular, could get wonderfully theatrical, because the guilds enforced quality not with quiet fines, but with public humiliation calculated to shame the offender and reassure the customer. A trade that depended on the public trusting its goods could not afford cheats in its ranks, so the punishments for selling shoddy or fraudulent wares were designed to be seen. A baker caught selling loaves that were underweight, cheating his customers of the bread they had paid for, might find himself dragged through the streets on a sledge for all to jeer at. The offending light loaf hung around his neck as a badge of his dishonesty. A merchant caught trying to pass off rotten or rancid food as fresh might have the spoiled goods burned beneath his own nose, so that he and everyone present had to endure the stench of his deceit, a punishment with a certain poetic efficiency to it. Wine sellers who watered down their product, cloth merchants who stretched and misrepresented their fabric, all faced the prospect of being held up to public ridicule, because in a small, dense, gossipy city, reputation was everything, and a guild that allowed its members to cheat would see the value of its whole name collapse. The regulation was self-interested, certainly, protecting the brand as much as the buyer, but it did mean that the medieval consumer enjoyed a rough sort of protection, enforced by men who understood that one rotten fishmonger could sour the reputation of every fishmonger in town. The religious and festive side of guild life deserves its own mention, because it shows how completely these trade bodies wove themselves into the fabric of the town. Each company typically had its patron saint and its own chapel or altar, and the brethren gathered not only to talk business, but to worship together, to pray for their dead, and to mark the great feasts of the year with processions and ceremony. The guilds were as much religious fraternities as commercial ones, and the line between the two would have seemed artificial to the people involved, for whom faith and work and community were all bound up together. In many towns, the companies also took on the staging of the great religious dramas, the cycles of plays that retold the stories of Scripture for the whole community, with each guild responsible for mounting a particular episode, often one cheekily matched to its trade, the shipwrights handling the building of the ark, for instance, and so on through the calendar of the year. These performances, known as mystery plays, took their name not from any sense of the mysterious, but from an old word for a craft or trade, the same root that gives us the idea of a person's profession, so that a mystery play was quite literally a craft play, put on by the working companies of the town. It was civic pride, religious devotion, and trade advertising rolled into one grand annual spectacle, the guilds showing off their wealth and piety to the assembled population. The trades even shaped the physical map of the town, since craftsmen of the same kind tended to cluster together on the same streets, partly for convenience and partly because the guild kept its members within easy reach of one another's oversight. Whole lanes became known by the trade that dominated them: the street of the goldsmiths, the row of the butchers, the quarter of the leatherworkers, the place where the bread was sold, and a great many of these names have survived for centuries in the streets of old cities, a fossil record of where the medieval crafts once clustered, so that a person walking a modern city is often, without knowing it, retracing the commercial geography of the guilds. In the great cities, and above all in London, these guilds grew into something far grander than mere trade bodies. They became the livery companies, wealthy and powerful corporations dressed in their own distinctive ceremonial clothing, the livery that gave them their name, and they accumulated such riches and influence that they effectively ran the city. And being medieval institutions, which is to say being utterly obsessed with rank and precedence, they could not simply coexist as equals, naturally not. They had to be ranked. They had to know, with absolute precision, who came first and who came second and who trailed along behind, because the question of which company outranked which was treated with a seriousness that modern observers find frankly delightful. At the summit sat a group known as the Great 12, the 12 most prestigious and powerful companies in London, and the order in which these 12 stood relative to one another was a matter of profound and enduring importance, a pecking order defended with the ferocity that only people with a great deal of pride and a great deal of money can muster. And ferocity is not too strong a word, because the question of precedence was taken so seriously that it could spill over into genuine violence. When two companies of roughly equal standing both believed they deserved the higher position, the dispute was not always settled by polite negotiation over a nice dinner. There were occasions when rival companies, jostling for their place in a civic procession or a public ceremony, came to actual blows in the street, their members brawling over which group had the right to walk ahead of the other. Picture it: grown men of wealth and standing, pillars of the commercial community, throwing punches in public over the burning question of whose guild got to go first in a parade. A spectacle that would be comic if these men had not been entirely, deadly serious about it. The matter of rank had become so bitter and so unresolvable that it sometimes had to be settled by the intervention of the highest authorities, and there is a famous instance in which a dispute between two of the great companies over which outranked the other was so intractable that it was eventually resolved by a formal ruling, fixing their relative positions and leaving them to alternate in a carefully prescribed order. That a question of mere ceremonial precedence required this level of official arbitration tells you everything about how central status was to these men. They had wealth, they had power, they had property and political office, and yet they could be moved to fury over the symbolic matter of who stood where. Because in a world built entirely on hierarchy, your place in the order was not a triviality. It was who you were. At the very top of this hierarchy, holding the coveted position of first among the Great 12, were the mercers, the merchants who dealt in fine textiles and luxury cloth, the silks and velvets and costly fabrics that draped the wealthy. Theirs was a trade of high value and high prestige, and they sat at the head of the table accordingly. Just below them, in the second position, came the grocers, and here the names themselves tell a story. The grocer was not, as the modern word suggests, a person who sold you vegetables and tinned beans. The name comes from the fact that these merchants dealt in goods by the gross, in bulk, and what they dealt in above all were the exotic and enormously valuable commodities that came from distant lands, the spices, pepper, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, the rare and precious flavourings that travelled vast distances along trade routes from the other side of the world to end up, at staggering markup, in the kitchens of the rich. The spice trade was one of the most lucrative businesses imaginable, since these were small, light, fantastically expensive goods, and the men who controlled their import grew correspondingly wealthy. The romance of their trade even crept into their heraldry, their official coats of arms, which featured such things as the camel, the beast of the great overland spice caravans, and the clove itself, the little dried flower bud worth its weight in silver. A company whose badge proudly displayed a camel and a clove was a company telling the world exactly where its money came from, and it came from the far ends of the earth. But membership in one of these companies was about far, far more than the right to trade, and this is the crucial point that separates the urban elite from everyone we have met so far. To be a member of a guild, a freeman of the city, was to hold a kind of citizenship that came loaded with political power. The freeman was not merely a man permitted to sell his goods, he was a man with a stake in the governance of the town itself. From the ranks of these freemen were drawn the aldermen, the senior men who governed the city wards and sat in council, and the aldermen in turn were the men eligible to rise to the very pinnacle of civic power, the office of Lord Mayor of London, the most powerful position in the city, a figure of genuine consequence who dealt with kings as a man of real standing. The path ran in a straight and exclusive line. Membership in the right company made you a freeman, being a freeman made you eligible to become an alderman, and being an alderman put you in the running for Lord Mayor. The entire apparatus of city government, all its authority and prestige, was reserved for the men inside the guilds, which meant that a relatively small circle of established merchants effectively owned not just the trade of the greatest city in the kingdom, but its politics as well. They were the electors and the elected, the rulers and the ruled, rolled into one tidy, self-perpetuating club. The physical seat of all this power was the company hall, the grand building where each great company conducted its business, held its feasts, stored its treasures, and displayed its wealth to anyone fortunate enough to be admitted. These halls were statements in stone and timber, deliberately impressive, hung with fine plate and rich furnishings, designed to announce that the company which owned them was a body of substance and permanence. They were, in effect, the headquarters of corporations that expected to outlast the men who built them, and many of them did. The companies persisting across the centuries as their individual members came and went, institutions with a continuity that few ordinary families could ever hope to match. And the privileges did not stop at politics. The companies were so wealthy and so entrenched that they owned substantial property within the city walls, holding land and buildings in the most valuable real estate in the realm, which made them landlords in their own right. A curious echo of the rural lords we left behind, except that these landlords had built their power on commerce rather than on inherited acres. They enjoyed all manner of peculiar and jealously defended rights and exemptions accumulated over generations, the kind of quirky privileges that medieval institutions collected like trophies. There is a charming example in the right, held by certain of these freemen to drive their livestock across London Bridge without paying the toll that everyone else had to cough up, a small but telling perk, the medieval equivalent of a special lane reserved for the important. Driving your sheep across the bridge while everyone else queued to pay was not about the money saved, which was trivial. It was about the status, the public demonstration that you were one of the privileged few to whom the ordinary rules did not apply, a small piece of theatre performed in full view of the toll-paying crowd, and as we shall see, the principle that the rules did not quite apply to these men extended a good deal further than bridge tolls. So how did one actually get into this charmed circle? How did a person become a member of a guild and thereby a freeman with all this power and protection? The medieval system had, with its usual fondness for orderly categories, essentially 4 recognised routes in, and understanding them tells you a great deal about how this society distributed opportunity, which is to say not very evenly. The first and easily the most comfortable route was by birth, what was called patrimony. If your father was a freeman of a company, then you, his child, had a hereditary claim to membership, the privilege passing down the bloodline like an inheritance. You did not earn it, you did not buy it, you were simply born to it, which is, as you may have noticed, the medieval solution to almost everything. The son of a member walked into the family business and the family club as a matter of right. The door held open for him before he had done a single thing to deserve it. The second route, and the one that did at least involve some genuine effort, was through apprenticeship. A young person, typically a boy, could be bound to an established master of a trade for a long term of years, usually 7, during which he would live in the master's household, learn the craft from the bottom up, and serve as cheap labour in exchange for his training and his keep. Complete the apprenticeship satisfactorily, and he could, in time, become a freeman in his own right, having earned his place through years of work and learning. This was the meritocratic path, more or less, the route by which a talented and diligent outsider might genuinely work his way into the club, though it required years of subordination and the good fortune of being taken on by a master in the first place. It was opportunity, but opportunity of a slow and effortful kind, available only to those who could secure a place and survive the long servitude. It is worth dwelling on that apprenticeship route a little longer, because the ladder a craftsman climbed from raw beginner to full master is one of the more revealing structures of the urban world, and it has left fingerprints all over the language we still use. The boy bound to a master began at the very bottom, an apprentice, a status somewhere between student, servant, and unpaid labourer, living under the master's roof and the master's authority, fed and housed and taught, but given little freedom and less money. The arrangement was sealed by a formal contract, the indenture, and it could be a hard road, since a cruel or stingy master could make those years genuinely miserable, and the records are dotted with apprentices who ran away from intolerable conditions, which was a serious matter given that they were, in effect, breaking a binding contract. But survived the term, learned the craft, and the apprentice graduated to the next rung, becoming what was called a journeyman. The name has nothing to do with travel, despite the modern ear, and everything to do with the French word for a day, because the journeyman was a craftsman who had completed his training, but did not yet have his own workshop, and so he worked for a master for a daily wage, paid by the day for his labour. He was skilled, he was free, but he was still working for someone else, saving and waiting for the chance to set up on his own. And to make that final leap, to rise from journeyman to master with his own shop and his own apprentices and his full place in the company, a craftsman traditionally had to prove that he had genuinely attained the highest level of skill in his trade. He did this by producing a single outstanding piece of work, a demonstration object crafted to show off everything he had learned, submitted for the judgment of the established masters who would decide whether he was worthy to join their ranks. This proof of skill, this crowning test piece, was called a masterpiece, and yes, that is exactly where the word comes from. Every time we use the word today to mean a supreme achievement, a painting or a novel or a film of the highest order, we are unknowingly reaching back to the medieval workshop and the nervous journeyman presenting his finest work to a panel of sceptical old masters, hoping to be admitted at last to the brotherhood. The whole vocabulary of skill and achievement is quietly stamped with the structure of these vanished trade societies. The third route was the most straightforwardly transactional, and it was called redemption, which is a polite way of saying you bought your way in. A person of sufficient means who was not born to membership and had not served an apprenticeship could, in certain circumstances, simply purchase his freedom of the company, paying a fee to be admitted. Money as ever opened doors that birth and labour otherwise guarded, and for a wealthy individual the redemption route was a convenient shortcut, a way to acquire the standing and privileges of membership through the simple expedient of being rich enough to afford them, no 7 years of servitude required, and no need to have chosen one's father wisely. The fourth and final route was the rarest and most flattering: admission by honorary invitation, the company choosing to bestow membership on someone as a mark of distinction, a recognition of status or service or usefulness. This was the route reserved for the already eminent, the powerful figure whom the company was pleased and proud to claim as one of its own. So the paths in were birth, labour, money and honour, and you will notice that 3 of the 4 favoured those who already had advantages, while only one, the long hard road of apprenticeship, offered a real opening to the genuine outsider. The club was not entirely sealed, but it was not exactly flinging its doors wide either. To see what life at the top of this urban world actually looked like, and to draw the contrast that this whole chapter has been building toward, let us follow a particular family of Mercers, the very first and most prestigious of the Great 12, a household we will call the Danvers. Hugh Danvers was a mercer of London in the early 14th century, and his life, as far as the records let us reconstruct it, was about as far from the precarious existence of a rural labourer as it was possible to get while still technically living in the same kingdom. The Danvers household was a substantial establishment, not a single struggling family clinging to a patch of ground, but a populous domestic enterprise, the kind of prosperous urban household that contained not only the family itself, but a whole supporting cast of apprentices learning the trade and servants running the home. It was a unit of both business and living combined, the shop and the household intertwined, bustling with the activity of commerce and the comings and goings of a man of consequence. Where a peasant family was a unit of survival, the Danvers household was a unit of enterprise and status, and the difference in scale and security between the two is the difference this chapter exists to illustrate. And Hugh Danvers was very much a man of consequence. The records show him holding real civic office, serving as a sheriff of London in the year 1314, one of the senior officials of the city, a position of genuine authority and prestige that placed him squarely among the governing elite. A man who served as sheriff was a man at the heart of the city's power structure, trusted with responsibility, recognised as a leader of the commercial community. We find him too in the role of a witness in legal proceedings, including a serious matter, a case of homicide in 1324, the kind of weighty business in which the testimony of a respected and substantial citizen carried weight precisely because of his standing. Here, in other words, was a pillar of the urban establishment, an office holder, a man whose word mattered in the courts, a freeman of the Premier Company, the very model of the successful, respectable, powerful townsman. By every outward measure, Hugh Danvers was exactly the sort of man the system held up as its finest product, a respectable citizen of the highest standing, which makes what the records also reveal about him all the more striking and all the more illuminating about how justice actually worked in this world. Because this same Hugh Danvers, Sheriff of London, trusted witness in murder trials, pillar of civic respectability, was also involved in robbing a neighbour of the staggering sum of around £200. Let that figure sink in for a moment, because it is the hinge on which this entire chapter turns. £200 was an enormous amount of money, a sum of a scale that would have been almost unimaginable to the ordinary people we have been following. To put it in the only terms that truly capture the gulf, cast your mind back to the ruined peasant Henry Marsh, forced by debt to sell his entire landholding, the foundation of his family's existence, the accumulated security of generations, back to the abbey for around £2, because as a serf he had no other buyer. The sum Hugh Danvers was mixed up in stealing was something like 100 times what a desperate peasant received for selling away everything he owned in the world. 100 times. The robbery in which this respectable sheriff was involved represented, in a single illicit grab, a fortune that dwarfed the entire material existence of a labouring family by 2 orders of magnitude. And here is the part that should make your jaw tighten, the detail that exposes the whole rotten machinery of medieval justice in one clean stroke. Hugh Danvers suffered no real consequence for it. He was not ruined, not cast down, not subjected to the brutal punishment that the law reserved for theft when committed by the powerless. He carried on, and the reason he escaped, as best we can tell, comes down to that quality which mattered more than guilt or innocence, more than law or evidence in this world where power bent justice to its will. He had connections, he had standing. He was, in particular, close to the circles of royal power, and proximity to the king was the great solvent that dissolved inconvenient legal troubles for those fortunate enough to possess it. A man with the right friends, the right offices, The right place in the web of influence that radiated out from the crown could be implicated in a theft of monstrous proportions and simply continue with his life and his career largely untouched, his respectability intact, his offices secure, his future bright. Now set that against the fate that awaited an ordinary person who stole. Recall the world we have spent this whole story in, the world where a peasant could be dragged into court over a debt of 5 shillings, where the loss of a few coins could begin a slide into ruin, where the law came down on the labouring poor with crushing weight for the smallest transgressions. For a common man to steal even a trifling sum was to risk the most severe penalties the law could impose, penalties applied with grim regularity to the powerless, precisely because they were powerless and had no friends to intervene. The contrast could hardly be more obscene. At one end of society, a labourer faces the full and terrible weight of the law for stealing almost nothing. At the other, a wealthy and well-connected merchant is mixed up in stealing a fortune 100-fold greater and walks away unscathed, his hand on the levers of the very justice system that would have destroyed a poorer man without a second thought. Justice, it turns out, was not blind at all. It saw exactly who stood before it, checked their rank and their connections, and ruled accordingly. This is the contrast that has been building beneath this entire series, and now it stands fully exposed. We began at the bottom of the pyramid, among people who could be owned, who were bound to the soil, who carried all the weight and reaped almost none of the reward, who could lose everything to a single bad decade and vanish from the record without a stone to mark them, and who, when they finally rose up to demand their dignity, were crushed and told they were rustics and would remain so. And here, a few rungs up, we find a class of men for whom the rules were soft and the law was negotiable, who guarded their privileges behind the walls of exclusive clubs, who ran the cities and chose their own rulers and drove their sheep across the bridge without paying, and who could be tangled in grand theft and emerge with their respectability polished, and their careers humming along, simply because they knew the right people and stood on the right side of the great divide between those who mattered and those who did not. It is worth being clear that this was not a matter of a few bad apples or isolated corruption, the kind of thing every society suffers and condemns. It was the system working exactly as it was built to work, the whole apparatus, the guilds and their monopolies, the freedom that was really membership, the civic offices reserved for the propertied, the cosy proximity to royal power, was an engine for concentrating advantage in the hands of those who already had it and insulating them from the consequences that fell so heavily on everyone else. The respectable merchant escaping his theft was not a glitch. He was the intended output. The law was harsh, and the law was real, but it was harsh and real chiefly for the people at the bottom, while for those at the top it softened into something more like a polite suggestion, easily set aside by anyone with the connections to set it aside. We will keep this gulf firmly in mind as we continue our climb, because we have only just begun to ascend from the labouring base into the more comfortable reaches of medieval society. And the higher we go, the wider this gap between obligation and privilege, between vulnerability and impunity, is going to grow. The townsman, for all his advantages over the peasant, was himself only part way up the slope. Above him still loomed the two estates that the textbooks have always cherished most, the men who claimed a monopoly on the next world, and the men who claimed a monopoly on force in this one. We turn next to the first of these, to the vast and powerful and endlessly contradictory institution that prayed for everyone's soul while quietly owning a remarkable share of everyone's land, the estate of those who pray, and we will find there the same tangle of high ideals and worldly power, of genuine devotion and naked self-interest that has run through every layer of this world we have been exploring. We have already discovered, more than once on this journey, that the estate devoted to prayer was also, rather awkwardly, the single greatest landowner in the medieval world, a body of men sworn to renounce earthly things who happened to control an astonishing share of the earth. We watched a wealthy abbey ride out the great famine in comfort while its tenants starved, and we watched it quietly swallow the ruined Henry Marsh's land for a pittance because, as a serf, he had nowhere else to sell. So we already know the punchline before we have properly told the joke. But the church was far more than a landlord with a halo, and to understand the estate of those who pray, we have to look at the whole vast, intricate, and frankly rather corporate structure of it, from the humble village priest right up to the man who claimed to speak for heaven itself, because this was the institution that touched every single life in this world, from the cradle to the grave, and it touched them with a thoroughness that no king or guild could match. Start at the bottom with the parish priest, because he was the face of the entire enormous machine for the ordinary person. Most people in this world never saw a bishop, let alone a pope, but everyone knew their parish priest, the local clergyman who served the village church and stood as the gatekeeper to the spiritual life of the community. His job was to deliver the sacraments, the sacred rituals that marked and sanctified the crucial passages of human existence. And these were not optional extras in this world, but the very scaffolding of a life, the means by which a person stayed right with God and avoided a genuinely terrifying eternity. The priest baptized the newborn, washing away original sin and admitting the infant into the Christian fold, which mattered enormously in a world of high infant mortality where an unbaptized baby was thought to face a grim fate. He heard confession, the regular unburdening of one's sins, and granted the absolution that wiped the slate clean. He performed marriages, binding couples in the eyes of God and the community. He administered the Eucharist, the central mystery of the faith, the bread and wine of the Mass. And at the end, he gave the last rites, the final anointing of the dying, the spiritual preparation for death that no one wanted to face without. From first breath to last, the priest was there, holding the keys to salvation at every threshold, which gave even the humblest village clergyman a quiet power over his flock that is hard to overstate. He was not merely a spiritual advisor. He was, in the popular understanding, the man who could open or close the door to heaven. But the parish priest was only the lowest rung of an immense and meticulously organized hierarchy, and here the church reveals itself as one of the most sophisticated management structures the medieval world ever produced. A vast multinational organization with a clear chain of command running from the village all the way to the top. Above the parish sat the bishop, a senior churchman responsible for overseeing a whole region full of parishes, his territory called a diocese. The bishop was based at a cathedral, the great church that served as his seat, and the administrative heart of his region, and these cathedrals were far more than places of worship. They were centres of learning and power, and crucially, they typically housed schools, the institutions where boys could be taught the Latin that was the language of the church, of learning, and of administration across the whole of Western Christendom. If you wanted an education in this world, the church was very nearly the only provider, and the cathedral school was where the literate class, the clerks and administrators and future churchmen got their start, which gave the church a near monopoly not just on salvation but on knowledge itself. Above the bishop stood the archbishop, a still more senior figure overseeing a group of dioceses, and at the very summit of the English church sat the Archbishop of Canterbury, the chief churchman of the land, a figure of immense authority who ranked among the most powerful men in the kingdom. But the structure did not stop at national borders, because the medieval church was a single international body, and above even the archbishops, in the wider church, stood the cardinals, the elite senior churchmen who advised at the highest level, and who held one particular power of enormous consequence. They elected the Pope. And the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, sat at the absolute pinnacle of the entire structure, the supreme head of the Western Church, claiming spiritual authority over all of Christendom, a single man at the top of a pyramid of clergy that reached down through cardinals and archbishops and bishops, all the way to the parish priest baptizing a baby in a muddy village. It was, in its scale and its reach and its careful gradations of rank, the closest thing the medieval world had to a true international superpower, an organization that transcended kingdoms and commanded the loyalty, the fear, and the tithes of millions. That word tithe is worth pausing on, because it is how the whole edifice was funded at the local level. The tithe was, in principle, a tenth of what people produced, owed to the church to support the clergy and the work of the parish. Everyone was expected to hand over their share, a portion of the grain, the lambs, the produce, the income, flowing steadily into the coffers of the church year after year. It was, in effect, a religious tax laid over the top of all the other dues and obligations the labouring people already groaned under, and while some of it genuinely supported the local priest and the upkeep of the church, a great deal of it flowed upward and outward into the wider wealth of the institution. The peasant, having paid his lord and paid the king, also paid his God, or rather paid God's earthly management company, and the tithe was one of the great reliable streams that made the church so spectacularly rich. So far we have described the clergy who lived in the world, serving parishes and running dioceses, but there was a whole other branch of the religious life that turned its back on the world entirely, and this is where we meet the monks, The monastic ideal was to withdraw from ordinary society altogether, to retreat behind the walls of a monastery and devote one's entire existence to God through a disciplined life of prayer, worship, and labour. The most influential model for this in the earlier medieval centuries came from the Benedictines, the monks who followed the rule laid down by Benedict, and their guiding principle was captured in a tidy Latin phrase, ora et labora, which means pray and work. Their days were divided between the two, a rhythm of religious devotion and useful labour that was meant to keep both the soul and the hands occupied and out of trouble. And one of the most consequential forms that labour took, for which we owe these men an enormous and often unacknowledged debt, was the copying of books. In an age before printing, every book had to be reproduced by hand, laboriously, page by page, letter by letter, and it was in the monasteries, in the quiet rooms set aside for the purpose, that monks bent over their desks copying out manuscripts, preserving the texts of Scripture and, crucially, a good deal of the learning of the ancient world that would otherwise have been lost. Those much maligned dark centuries were, in part, kept alight by monks patiently copying books that nobody else was bothering to save, which is not the image of medieval intellectual life that most people carry around. The monasteries grew, over the centuries, enormously wealthy and enormously comfortable, which created an obvious and rather embarrassing tension. Here were communities founded on the ideal of renouncing worldly goods that had become, through the steady accumulation of land and gifts and bequests, some of the richest institutions in the realm, with abbots living in a style that would not have shamed a noble lord. The monks who had supposedly fled the world found themselves sitting on a very large slice of it, and this gap between the ideal of poverty and the reality of wealth did not go unnoticed, least of all by people who took the ideal seriously. Which brings us to a genuine spiritual revolution that swept through the church in the 13th century, a passionate reaction against exactly this comfortable, landed, worldly religion. A new kind of religious order appeared, the mendicant orders, the orders of friars, and they were founded on a radically different idea. Where the old monks withdrew behind walls and accumulated estates, the friars were to own nothing, to embrace genuine poverty, to depend on charity for their daily bread, and most importantly, to go out into the world rather than retreat from it, walking among ordinary people, preaching directly to them in the towns and the marketplaces and the streets. The towering figure behind this movement was Francis of Assisi, a man who had given up a comfortable life to embrace what was called apostolic poverty, the attempt to live as the first followers of Christ supposedly had, with no possessions and no security, trusting entirely to God and the generosity of others. It was a powerful and genuinely moving ideal, a deliberate rebuke to the wealth and pomp of the established church, and the friars who followed it spread rapidly, becoming hugely popular precisely because they seemed to practice the humility and poverty that the rich old institution merely preached. You can probably see the conflict coming, because nothing in this story ever stays harmonious for long. The arrival of the friars, popular and energetic and going directly to the people, did not please the existing clergy one bit, and the parish priests in particular regarded these newcomers with deep suspicion and resentment. The reason was partly spiritual jealousy, but it was also, in the time-honoured fashion, about money. The friars, by preaching to the people, hearing their confessions and winning their devotion, were effectively muscling in on the parish priest's territory and, crucially, on his income. When a person gave alms or sought spiritual services from a charismatic visiting friar, rather than from the local priest, that was support and money flowing to the friars instead of to the parish. The parish clergy saw the friars as interlopers, poachers, intercepting the offerings and the loyalty that they felt rightfully belonged to them, and the tension between the settled parish clergy and the roving friars became one of the running sores of church life, a turf war dressed up in the language of competing spiritual ideals. It is a wonderfully human spectacle, two groups of holy men squabbling over who gets to collect the donations, each convinced of its own superior virtue. But the most serious challenge to the church came not from within its own ranks, but from outright critics who looked at the whole magnificent, wealthy, powerful institution and concluded that something had gone badly wrong, that an organisation founded by a poor preacher had become a bloated landlord drunk on riches and power. The most significant of these critics in England was a scholar named John Wycliffe, a learned and formidable theologian who launched a stinging attack on the wealth and worldliness of the church. Wycliffe argued that the church had strayed disastrously from its proper spiritual mission, that its vast riches and lands were a corruption of everything it was supposed to stand for, and he challenged some of its most fundamental claims to authority. Most dangerously of all, he believed that ordinary people should be able to access the Word of God directly, in their own language, rather than having it mediated and controlled by a Latin-speaking clergy, an idea that struck at the very root of the Church's monopoly on salvation and knowledge. Wycliffe's ideas inspired a movement of followers who came to be known as the Lollards, a somewhat mocking name whose exact origin is murky, but which stuck to these religious dissidents. The Lollards took up Wycliffe's criticisms and ran with them, condemning the wealth and corruption of the established church and, strikingly, training and sending out their own preachers to spread these ideas among the people, bypassing the official clergy entirely. This was genuinely subversive stuff, an attempt to build an alternative religious teaching outside the control of the church hierarchy, and the authorities regarded it as a dangerous heresy to be stamped out, which they eventually set about doing with considerable severity. But the ideas, like the radical notions of the rebels we met earlier, proved difficult to fully extinguish, and they planted seeds of dissent and reform that would resurface with enormous consequences in the centuries to come. There is one more curious feature of the clerical estate worth knowing, because it produced a delightful quirk in how medieval society policed itself. Because the church controlled education, and because anyone connected with learning was technically a member of the clergy, the students who flocked to the early universities counted, in a formal legal sense, as clergymen, even when their behaviour was about as far from saintly as it is possible to get. Universities were full of young men, often rowdy, frequently drunk, perpetually getting into fights and scrapes with the ordinary inhabitants of the towns they studied in, and this produced the famous and enduring tension between the students and the townspeople, the long-running friction between town and gown, the gown being the academic dress that marked out the scholars. And here is the convenient part, at least if you were a scholar. Because students were technically clergy, they could often claim the right to be tried not in the ordinary town courts, with their harsh and unsympathetic justice, but in the church courts, which dealt with the clergy, and which were, shall we say, considerably gentler in their treatment of those who came before them. A student who got into a brawl and would have faced grim punishment in a town court could instead, by claiming his clerical status, have his case shifted to the more lenient church court, escaping the worst consequences. It was in effect a get-out-of-jail card available to anyone who could plausibly claim to belong to the church, and it meant that the educated and the clergy operated under a different and softer system of justice than ordinary people, which by now should surprise absolutely no one. The pattern we saw with the well-connected merchant escaping his theft repeats itself here in a different key. The rules were always softer for those on the right side of the great divides. Pulling all this together, the church emerges as something genuinely double-natured, and that double nature is the key to understanding it. On one hand, it was a real spiritual power, the institution that held the keys to the next world, that comforted the dying and baptized the newborn and gave meaning and structure to every life, that preserved learning and inspired genuine devotion and produced figures of real holiness like Francis. On the other hand, it was a colossal worldly power, the largest landlord in the realm as we have long established, a fabulously wealthy corporation collecting tithes and rents from millions, running a near monopoly on education, wielding its own legal system and tangled up in money and influence and turf wars at every level. It was both the gateway to heaven and one of the great economic and political machines of the age, and it never seemed to find this combination as awkward as an outsider might expect. And that enormous accumulation of land and treasure, that vast wealth gathered behind monastery walls and cathedral closes, would eventually prove an irresistible temptation to a later king. When Henry VIII came along and broke with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries and the seizure of their immense landed wealth was not merely a matter of theology. It was, in very large part, the crown finally getting its hands on the single, richest prize in the kingdom, the accumulated estates of the praying estate, which had spent centuries quietly becoming far too wealthy for its own long-term safety. The church had made itself rich beyond measure, and in doing so had made itself a target, though that reckoning lay well in the future. Now we ascend to the final estate, the one the textbooks have always adored above all others, the glittering apex of the whole pyramid, the people who fought, or at least claimed the exclusive right to, the nobility. This was the world of kings and the great lords beneath them, the dukes and earls and barons, and at the broad base of the noble class, the knights, the armoured fighting men who were the muscle of the whole system. And the founding principle of this estate, the deal at the heart of it, was beautifully and brutally simple. Land and titles were granted in exchange for military service. The king, who in theory owned everything, parcelled out great estates to his most powerful followers, and in return those followers owed him military service, the duty to fight for him, and to bring their own followers to fight when called. Those great lords in turn parcelled out portions of their land to lesser men, the knights, in exchange for the same service, so that the whole society was bound together in a web of land granted upward in loyalty and military obligation, a pyramid of mutual duty resting ultimately on the ability and willingness to make war. In England, this arrangement was stamped onto the country with particular force by the Norman conquest, the invasion that overthrew the old order and installed a new ruling class of foreign warriors who divided up the land among themselves as the spoils of victory. The new king rewarded the followers who had won him his crown with vast grants of English land, and an entirely new aristocracy was planted on top of the conquered population, an aristocracy that held its lands precisely on the basis of the military service it owed. To get a grip on just how systematically the conquerors carved up and recorded their new possessions, you need only consider the great survey they commissioned, the famous Domesday Book, an extraordinarily thorough inventory of the land, its owners, its value, and its resources, compiled so that the crown knew exactly what it had conquered and exactly what could be squeezed out of it. It was a tax assessor's dream and a conquered people's nightmare, a document so comprehensive and so final in its judgments that it earned its grim nickname, the book against which there was no appeal, as final as the day of doom itself. To put a human face on this conquering aristocracy, consider the family of the de Vereux, a clan whose fortunes trace the whole arc of noble power in England. A man named Aubrey de Vere came over in the wake of the conquest, and was rewarded with substantial holdings, and we find his name recorded in that great survey, a founder planting his family on English soil. From these beginnings, the de Vere rose to the heights of the nobility, becoming the Earls of Oxford, one of the great comital titles of the realm, and accumulating land on a scale that dwarfs anything we have seen among peasants or merchants, holdings spread across 9 counties. Cast your mind back to the ruined Henry Marsh and his few acres, his whole world a single fragile plot, and set against it a family whose lands sprawled across 9 separate counties, and you have the entire span of medieval society laid out in a single comparison. The de Vere did not worry about losing everything to one bad harvest. They worried about the kind of things that powerful dynasties worry about, succession and royal favour and the endless game of high politics, and their power, founded on conquest and military service, endured for an extraordinarily long stretch of history, the family tracing its noble line across the centuries while countless labouring families rose and vanished without leaving so much as a name. And nothing announced noble power quite like the castle, the great fortified residence that was at once a fortress, a home, an administrative centre, and above all a colossal statement of dominance. Take the de Vere's own great stronghold, the castle at Hedingham, which stands as one of the finest surviving examples of the architecture the Norman conquerors brought with them. The earliest Norman castles followed a design known as motte and bailey, a clever and quickly built arrangement consisting of a raised mound of earth, the motte topped by a fortified tower, and an enclosed courtyard beside or below it. The bailey, where the supporting buildings stood, the whole thing ringed by defences. As the centuries passed, these earth and timber fortifications were replaced by mighty structures of stone, and the great stone keep became the iconic image of the castle, a massive tower built to dominate and to endure. Such a castle was protected by a moat, a water-filled ditch encircling it, crossed by a bridge that could be controlled and defended, so that access to the stronghold was channeled and guarded at every point. Inside, the keep at Hedingham boasts a feature that genuinely impresses, an enormous arch, a great curve of stone spanning the main hall, and it is among the largest surviving arches of its kind from the Norman period, a span of something like 28 feet that would have left a visitor craning his neck in awe. And that awe was entirely the point, which brings us to one of the most delightful corrections of popular misconception in this whole story. We tend to picture medieval castles, and indeed the whole medieval world, as grey, cold, austere places, all bare stone and gloom. This is quite wrong. The interiors of these great castles were not drab at all. They were brightly, even garishly, painted and decorated, the stone walls washed with vivid colours, adorned with bold geometric patterns. The zigzag chevron designs the Normans loved scattered across the architecture, the whole space made as rich and colourful and impressive as the owner could afford. A great hall was meant to dazzle, to overwhelm a visitor with the wealth and might of the lord who commanded it, and a riot of bright paint and bold pattern did exactly that. The medieval castle was not a grim grey box. It was a deliberately lavish, colourful, intimidating display of power, the architectural equivalent of a man flexing. The men who owned these castles belonged to a warrior culture with its own elaborate code and its own peculiar relationship to violence, and this is where we encounter the famous notion of chivalry. The word itself gives away its origins, deriving as it does from the word for horse, the same root that gives us cheval, because the knight was above all a mounted warrior, a man who fought on horseback, and the horse was the very emblem of his status and his military function. A knight was not made overnight. He was trained for war from childhood, raised from boyhood in the arts of combat, riding and weaponry, sent often to be brought up in another noble household, where he would learn his trade as a page and then a squire before finally being made a knight. The whole long apprenticeship aimed at producing a man bred and built for fighting. Chivalry, the code that governed this warrior class, was a mixture of genuine ideals about honour, loyalty, courage, and the proper treatment of others, and a good deal of self-serving myth that flattered the nobility and dressed up their monopoly on violence as something noble and refined. And here we come to one of the more revealing truths about medieval warfare among the nobility, because for the knightly class, war was not quite the lethal horror it was for the common foot soldier. For the wealthy and well-born, war could be something closer to an extremely dangerous and expensive game, a kind of high-stakes sport played among gentlemen, because a captured noble was worth far more alive than dead. The custom of ransom meant that when a knight or lord was taken prisoner in battle, he was not simply killed but held captive and ransomed back to his family for an enormous sum, a fortune that could make the captor rich. So the nobility had every incentive to capture rather than kill one another, and a battle among the well-born could be, for them, a strange affair in which the real prize was not the enemy's death, but his valuable captured person. It was, in a grim sense, a game of tag for the rich, where being caught meant not death but a very large bill, while the ordinary soldiers doing the actual dying enjoyed no such consideration. The peasant levy who fell on the field was simply dead, with no ransom and no mercy, while the noble who fell into enemy hands looked forward to comfortable captivity and eventual release once the money was paid. War, like justice, like everything else in this world, came in two very different versions depending on who you were. This sporting attitude to violence spilled over into peacetime as well, in the form of the tournament, the great martial spectacle in which knights tested their skill against one another in mock combat. Tournaments were part training exercise, part entertainment, part showing off, and part genuine opportunity, since in the earlier days a knight who unhorsed his opponent could claim that opponent's horse and armour as a prize, turning the tournament into yet another way for a skilled fighter to profit from his trade. They could be dangerous, occasionally fatally so, since mock combat with real weapons has a way of going wrong, but they were enormously popular, drawing crowds and giving the warrior class a stage on which to display the prowess that justified its privileged position. The tournament was the knightly class advertising itself, performing its reason for existing in front of an admiring audience, war repackaged as glamorous sport. And to know who was who amid all this armoured display, the nobility developed an entire visual language of identity, the system of heraldry. Since a man encased in armour was effectively anonymous, knights took to bearing distinctive painted designs on their shields and surcoats, unique combinations of colours and symbols by which they could be recognised on the field and in the lists. These coats of arms became hereditary, passed down through noble families as proud emblems of lineage, governed by elaborate rules about who could bear what, a whole formal grammar of stripes and beasts and colours that announced a family's identity and pedigree at a glance. It was, in a sense, the branding of the noble class, a visual shorthand for bloodline and status, and like so much about the nobility it was concerned above all with proclaiming who you were and where you stood in the order of things. The castle itself was engineered, down to its smallest details, as a machine for projecting power and instilling fear, and the cleverness of this is genuinely impressive once you know what to look for. Consider the experience of a visitor approaching the seat of a great lord. At the entrance he would encounter the guardroom, a clear reminder that he came and went at the pleasure of the armed men. As he made his way toward the Lord, the architecture was designed to work on his nerves, and there are wonderful examples of the careful psychology of intimidation built right into the stone. Near the seat where the Lord held court, there might be concealed recesses, hidden niches in the walls where guards could be stationed out of sight, so that a visitor standing before the Lord never quite knew how many armed men were watching him from the shadows. An unsettling uncertainty deliberately engineered into the room, and the very staircases were sometimes built to disadvantage a visitor, so that by the time he had climbed up to present himself before the Lord, he arrived slightly breathless, a little flustered, his composure already compromised while the Lord sat waiting perfectly at ease in command of the space. Every element of the design, from the guarded entrance to the hidden watchers to the wearying climb, was calculated to remind the visitor of his own smallness and the Lord's overwhelming might before a single word was spoken. It was theatre, but theatre with a very serious purpose, the constant performance of dominance. And here, having climbed all the way from the muddy strips of the open field to the brightly painted great hall of the conquering nobility, we must not lose sight of the single most important fact of all, the fact that underlies this entire glittering apex of medieval society. None of it, not one stone of the castle, not one thread of the Lord's finery, not one course of the feast in the great hall, not the leisure to train for war from childhood or to play the expensive game of ransom. None of it was produced by the nobility themselves. All of it rested, every bit of it, on the labour of the vast invisible multitude we began with, the labouring people whose toil grew the food, raised the wool, paid the dues, and generated the wealth that the Lord then spent on his castle and his wars and his magnificent intimidating displays. The shining world of the nobility was built entirely on the backs of the people the textbooks forgot, the 80% who worked so that the few could fight and pray and rule. The Lord in his colourful hall and the priest at his altar, and the merchant in his company hall all stood, ultimately on the same foundation, the silent, unending labour of the men and women at the bottom, and that is the thread that ties this whole world together. So we have toured all 4 worlds now, climbed the whole pyramid from the cold strips of the open field to the brightly painted halls of the conquering nobility, and it is time at last to do the thing the title of this whole journey promised, to set these 4 lives side by side and ask, plainly and in concrete terms, what medieval life was actually like for every class. Because the truth that emerges when you line them up is the truth this entire story has been quietly building toward. These were not 4 points on a single ladder, where everyone faced the same conditions and merely had more or less of the same things. They were 4 genuinely different existences, 4 separate realities unfolding under the same sky in the same century, and the gulf between them was so vast that to call them all part of one society almost strains the meaning of the word. A peasant and an earl shared a king, a language, and a religion, and almost nothing else. And even those few things they shared, they experienced from opposite ends, the one kneeling and the other ruling. Let us begin with the contrast that has haunted this whole story, the one that exposes the machinery more clearly than any other, the matter of justice and what happened to you when you broke the rules. Recall the ordinary labourer who could be dragged into court over a debt of 5 shillings, a sum so modest it would barely register to anyone above him, and recall that for a common man to steal even a trifling amount was to risk the most severe penalty the law could impose, very likely his life, applied with grim regularity precisely because he had no friends to intervene on his behalf. Now set against that the case of Hugh Danvers, the respectable mercer and sheriff, who was tangled up in the theft of around £200, a fortune roughly 100 times what a ruined peasant received for selling away every acre he owned, and who walked away from it essentially untouched, his career intact, his respectability polished, saved by his standing and his closeness to royal power. There it is, the whole rotten arithmetic in 2 numbers. Steal almost nothing while poor and lose everything, including possibly your life. Steal a fortune while powerful and well-connected, and lose nothing at all. Justice did not weigh the crime. It weighed the criminal, checked his rank, and ruled accordingly. The same act, the same theft, became 2 entirely different things depending on whose hands committed it. A hanging offence at the bottom, and a recoverable embarrassment at the top, and everyone involved understood this perfectly well, which is rather the point. The law was not failing to live up to an ideal of equality. It had never pretended to such an ideal in the first place, and this was not merely a matter of how harshly the same court treated different people. It went deeper than that, because the different estates did not even answer to the same courts. The peasant for most of the business of his life was subject to the court of his lord, the manorial court where the lord profited from the fines, and where justice and the lord's revenue were comfortably married, a system in which the man judging you was very often the same man you owed everything to. The clergy, as we saw, answered to the church courts, that notably gentler system that softened the consequences for anyone who could claim a connection to the church, right down to the rowdy students who escaped the town jail by pleading their clerical status. And the nobility at the top operated in a realm where justice was less a matter of courts at all than of royal favour, where the powerful settled their affairs through their relationships with the crown, and where falling foul of the law often meant falling foul of the king personally, to be saved or destroyed by his mercy, rather than by any impartial weighing of right and wrong. 3 estates, 3 entirely separate systems of justice, each calibrated to the standing of the person it judged. The idea that the law might apply equally to all would have struck nearly everyone in this world as not merely impractical, but faintly absurd. Consider next the matter of freedom itself, the most fundamental difference of all, the one stamped into the very vocabulary of the age. At the bottom, the serf was unfree in the most literal sense, bound to the land, unable to leave, his very person counted among the assets of the manor and inherited along with the fields and the livestock. He could not simply choose to go, to seek a better life elsewhere, to walk away from a cruel lord because his feet were planted in the soil by law and custom. And then, just a rung or 2 up, in the town, we find the very word that defines the opposite condition, the freeman, the free man, whose freedom was precisely the thing that distinguished him, that made him a citizen with a stake in his own governance, rather than a possession bound to another man's earth. The language could hardly be more pointed. The defining feature of the urban elite was packed right into the name they wore, freedom, and the defining feature of the labouring majority was its absence. To be a man in this world was, at the most basic level, to be either bound or free, and which one you were was decided, like everything else, by the accident of your birth. The food on the table tells the same story from a different angle, because even the most basic question of what a person ate sorted neatly by estate, at the bottom the diet was built on the coarser grains, the dark dense bread of rye and barley, the pottage of peas and beans, the ale brewed at home, a diet that filled the belly and kept a body working but rarely rose above the functional, and which collapsed entirely into hunger the moment a harvest failed. Higher up, the table grew richer and more varied, the finer white bread that the wealthy preferred, more meat, more of the things that had to be bought rather than merely grown. And at the summit, in the great hall of the Lord, the feast became a performance in its own right, an abundance of meats and rich dishes, and, for those who could afford the staggering prices, those exotic spices carried half the world to flavour the food of the powerful, the pepper and cloves that the grocers grew rich importing, the same century that left a peasant family one bad summer away from starvation set before its lords, a groaning table flavoured with the rarest goods on earth, and the distance between those 2 meals is the distance between the bottom of the pyramid and the top measured in courses. The roof over your head told the same story as the food on your plate. The labouring family typically lived in a small, simple dwelling, often a single room or 2, built of humble materials, with a hearth in the middle and the smoke finding its own way out, and in many cases the household shared its space with its animals, the livestock housed under the same roof at one end, partly for warmth and partly because a beast was far too valuable to leave outside where it might be stolen or freeze. It was, by any modern standard, cramped, smoky, and crowded, though it was also warm in its way, and entirely suited to a life lived mostly out of doors in the fields. The townsmen of means lived in something altogether grander, a tall, narrow house fronting the street, the ground floor often given over to the shop or workshop and the family living above, a building of real substance reflecting the wealth of trade. The clergy, depending on their rank, lived everywhere from a modest parsonage to the comfortable lodgings of a cathedral, close to the frankly luxurious quarters of a wealthy abbot. And the noble, of course, had his castle or his great manor house, with its painted hall and its many rooms and its retinue of servants, a dwelling that was less a home than a seat of power. From a smoky one-room cottage shared with the cow to a brightly painted hall designed to overawe visitors, The simple question of where a person slept at night sorted them as neatly into their stations as everything else did. You could, in fact, read a person's entire place in the world simply by looking at what they wore, and this was so reliably true that the authorities eventually tried to enforce it by law. Clothing in this world was a uniform of rank, the rough, undyed, practical garments of the labourer standing at one end, and the rich fabrics, bright dyes, and fine furs of the powerful at the other, with every gradation in between, announcing exactly where its wearer stood. And as the prosperous merchant class grew wealthy enough to dress above what their birth supposedly entitled them to, the upper ranks grew anxious about the blurring of these visible distinctions, and the response was wonderfully revealing. They passed laws, the sumptuary laws, which actually attempted to dictate what people of different ranks were permitted to wear, reserving certain fabrics, certain colours, certain furs and ornaments for the upper classes, and forbidding them to everyone below so that a wealthy commoner could be legally barred from dressing in a manner that might cause him to be mistaken for his betters. Think about what that means. The hierarchy was considered so important, and the prospect of confusing the ranks so genuinely alarming, that it had to be written into law that a rich merchant could not wear the wrong kind of cloth, lest the whole carefully maintained visual order of society dissolve into uncertainty about who was actually who. It is, when you sit with it, an almost comic confession of insecurity, a ruling class so worried about being visually outshone by the newly wealthy that it legislated the dress code, and like most attempts to freeze a changing society in place, it was fighting a losing battle against the simple fact that money was beginning to talk louder than birth. Even the experience of time itself, of work and rest, differed sharply by station. We tend to imagine the medieval labourer as toiling endlessly without pause, and the work was certainly brutal and constant in its seasons. But the year was also studded with a remarkable number of religious festivals and holy days on which work stopped and the community gathered to celebrate, days of feasting and games and rest woven through the calendar by the church, so that the labouring year had a rhythm of exhausting effort, punctuated by genuine communal holidays. The very word holiday is simply a worn-down holy day, a reminder that the breaks in the working year were religious festivals in origin. For the labourer, leisure came in these scattered communal bursts, earned and bounded by the demands of the fields. For the noble, by contrast, leisure was not an occasional festival, but very nearly the entire point, since the whole privilege of his position was precisely that he did not have to labour at all, his time given over to hunting, to feasting, to the tournament, to the elaborate social rituals of his class, his life one long demonstration that work was for other people. The peasant rested when the church and the season allowed. The lord rested whenever he pleased, which was most of the time, and called it nobility. And then there is the most basic measure of all, the one that hung over every single person in this world, regardless of which estate they were sorted into, the question of how long you would actually live. Life in this age was short and precarious by our standards across the board, with death an ever-present companion in a world without modern medicine, where disease could carry off the strong and the weak alike, and where the simple business of being born was dangerous for mother and child together. But even here, even in the face of death, the estates were not equal, because the poor died younger and more often than the rich, worn down by harder labour, thinner diets, worse shelter, and a complete absence of any cushion against the bad years. A noble child and a peasant child both faced fearsome odds of surviving to adulthood, but the peasant child faced worse ones, and the labourer who did survive aged faster and died sooner, ground down by a life of toil that the noble was spared. There was one grim leveller, the great pestilence we have already met, which swept through every rank without much caring for titles or wealth, carrying off lords and labourers and bishops alike, a rare moment when death genuinely ignored the pyramid. But even the great mortality, for all its terrible democracy, ultimately reshaped the world in ways that, as we saw, the survivors at the bottom could at least briefly turn to their advantage. For the most part, in the ordinary running of things, your estate shaped not only how you lived but how long, the same accident of birth that decided your freedom and your food and your justice, quietly reaching forward to help decide the very length of your days. But perhaps the most quietly devastating contrast of all is the one we measure not in a single lifetime but across the generations, in the simple question of whether your family endured or vanished. Cast your mind back to the Marsh family, the prosperous, respected peasant household we followed into ruin, the man who had been trusted to guarantee his neighbours' debts and who died burdened and diminished, his land swallowed by the abbey, his daughters disappearing from the records entirely within a few years of his death, very possibly into the mass grave of the Great Famine. An entire family, comfortable and established, erased from history within the span of a single decade, leaving behind nothing but a scattering of court entries about debts and a sale of land, the faint fingerprints of people who were here and then simply were not. Now set against that the De Vere, the noble dynasty we traced from a follower of the conquest recorded in the Great Survey, rising to become earls, holding land across 9 counties, and tracing their proud line not for a decade but across century after century, an unbroken thread of name and title and lineage that endured while countless families like the Marshes rose and fell and vanished beneath them. That is the difference durability makes. The peasant family was a candle in a draught, here and gone. The noble family was carved in stone, designed to outlast the very memory of everyone who served it. And the records reflect exactly that, lavishing their attention on the dynasties that persisted, and forgetting almost entirely the families that flickered out, which is precisely why we had to work so hard, digging through dry court rolls, even to glimpse a family like the Marshes at all. It is fair to ask at this point whether anyone could move between these worlds at all, whether the sorting at birth was truly final, or whether there were ladders a determined person might climb. And the honest answer is that mobility existed but was rare, a few narrow cracks in an otherwise rigid structure. The most reliable ladder, surprisingly, ran through the church, because the clergy recruited on the basis of learning rather than birth, and a clever boy of humble origins who could get himself an education, who could be noticed by a local priest and sent on to a cathedral school to learn his Latin, might genuinely rise through the ranks of the church to a position of real power and comfort that his station at birth would never have allowed. The church was the closest thing this world had to an escalator for talent, the one institution where a poor man's son might, with luck and ability, end up advising the powerful. The town offered another crack, that old custom by which a serf who escaped and survived in a chartered town long enough could shed his bondage and begin again as a free man, and the slow path of apprenticeship by which an outsider might work his way into the trading class. And marriage offered a third, the possibility, however uncommon, of rising through an advantageous match, money marrying into status or status into money. But these were the exceptions that proved the rule, the rare individuals who slipped through the cracks, and for the overwhelming majority the estate of their birth was the estate of their death. You were born into your world, and your world, in almost every case, kept you. There is one more comparison we owe this story, and it is one that cuts across all 4 estates at once, because it concerns a group of people who were present in every single one of them, and yet were systematically written out of all of them, and that group is women. We have brushed against their lives throughout this journey, and it is time to gather those threads together, because the experience of women in this world is its own revealing map of how the whole society worked, a story of indispensable labour and real power coexisting maddeningly with profound and formal exclusion. Start again at the bottom with the women of the labouring estate, because we have already seen that the apparent prosperity of a peasant household so often rested on their largely uncounted work. It was women who carried the cottage economy, who brewed the ale that the village drank and sold the surplus that brought in vital extra income, who spun the thread and wove the cloth so universally that the very word for an unmarried woman, the spinster, came from the work, and they did all of this on top of labouring in the fields, raising the children and running the household, a relentless double load that the records written by men and concerned with men's obligations mostly failed to credit. And we saw, in the story of the ruined peasant family, a detail that reveals women in this world were not the propertyless dependents the simple story imagines, because it was the wife's dowry land, protected by custom from being seized for the husband's debts, that alone kept the family from total destitution when everything else was lost. A woman could hold property that even her husband's creditors could not touch, and sometimes the whole family's survival rested on exactly that protection, a real and meaningful right hiding inside a world we tend to imagine as offering women none at all. Climb into the town and the picture is much the same, real economic importance shadowed by formal exclusion. The wife of a merchant or a craftsman was very often a genuine partner in the family enterprise, not a decorative ornament but an active participant who might manage the books, run the shop, handle the business when her husband was away or after he died, keeping the accounts and the trade going with full competence. Many a widow carried on her late husband's business in her own right, a recognised and capable figure in the commercial life of the town, and yet, for all this real involvement in trade, women were largely shut out of the formal structures of power that we spent so long examining. The guilds with their membership, and their freedom, and their path to civic office. The clubs that ran the towns were men's clubs, and a woman, however skilled, however essential to the actual running of a business, generally could not become a freeman in her own right, with all the political power that entailed, could not become an alderman, could not dream of becoming Lord Mayor. She could do the work. She simply could not hold the membership, the formal status, that turned work into power. The competence was hers, the citizenship was not, and no amount of competence could purchase it. In the estate of those who pray, women found one of the few institutional spaces of their own, in the convents and nunneries where they lived the religious life as nuns, devoting themselves to prayer and worship in communities that paralleled the monasteries of the men. For a certain kind of woman, particularly one of good birth, the convent offered something genuinely valuable, a refuge, a degree of autonomy, an alternative to marriage, even the chance at education and leadership within the female religious community, where an abbess could be a figure of real authority and standing. When the great wave of mendicant devotion swept through the church, it produced a female counterpart to the friars as well, an order of women devoted to the same ideal of poverty and religious simplicity, the Poor Clares, founded in the same spirit as the followers of Francis and named for their own foundress, women who embraced the radical poverty that the times had made fashionable among the genuinely devout. So the religious life gave women a place, a role, even a measure of power and learning, but it was a place firmly within the structures the Church allowed them, never at the true summit, for the priesthood and the bishoprics and the cardinalates and the papacy itself remained, of course, entirely closed to them. A woman could rule a convent. She could not say the Mass, and that single line marked the ceiling above which no woman, however holy or however highborn, was ever permitted to rise. And at the very top, among the nobility, women were at once enormously valuable, and almost entirely instruments of other people's strategies, because the noble marriage was the great mechanism by which alliances were forged, lands were joined, and bloodlines were advanced. A high-born woman was a piece of enormous dynastic significance, her marriage a matter of careful calculation, a tool for binding families together and climbing the ladder of power, and through such marriages noble women entered the most exalted circles, even the circle of the king himself, becoming through their unions figures of real influence at the heart of power. A well-married noblewoman might wield considerable informal authority, manage vast estates in her husband's absence, and shape the fortunes of her family through her connections and her children, and yet the very thing that made her valuable, her marriageability, also defined her largely as an asset to be deployed, her own preferences frequently the least important factor in decisions that would determine the entire course of her life. She could rise to dizzying heights, but typically as the wife or mother or daughter of powerful men rather than as a power in her own right, her influence real, but exercised through the men around her rather than in her own name. Pull all of this together and a striking pattern emerges that holds across every single estate, from the spinning peasant to the account-keeping merchant's wife to the ruling abbess to the alliance-sealing noblewoman. In every layer of society, women did essential work, held real and sometimes surprising forms of power, and were utterly indispensable to the functioning of the whole. And in every layer of society they were formally excluded from the highest and most official forms of authority, shut out of the guilds, barred from the Latin schools that were the gateway to learning and administration, locked out of the priesthood at its upper reaches, and treated even at the summit largely as the means by which men advanced rather than as ends in themselves. The exclusion was not the same in each estate, but the shape of it was real power and real labour everywhere, formal authority almost nowhere, a half of the population doing an enormous share of the work and getting a vanishingly small share of the recognition, which is why, when we read the records, the women are even harder to find than the labouring men, twice obscured, once by their class and once by their sex. And that brings us, at the very end of this long journey, to the single thread that ties together everything we have seen, the deep reason the whole story has had the shape it has had. Think about who the records were kept by and for, who could command a chronicler to write down their deeds and a mason to carve their tomb, whose lives were considered worth the parchment. It was, overwhelmingly, the people at the top, the dynasties that endured, the men who held office and bore arms and stood close to the throne. History, as it came down to us, was written by and about the people who could, when things went wrong, go and ask the king for mercy, the people whose names and quarrels and triumphs were deemed significant enough to preserve. The Great Survey recorded the conquerors and their holdings. The chronicles followed the kings and the bishops and the earls. The monuments commemorated the powerful. And the result is that we know an enormous amount about the tiny sliver of people at the top of the pyramid, and remarkably painfully little about the vast multitude at the bottom, the labouring majority, the roughly 80% of the whole population who grew the food and raised the wool and built the castles and paid for the abbeys, and who were judged century after century simply not important enough to write about. The people who did the most were remembered the least. The people who mattered most to the actual functioning of the world were the ones the world bothered least to record. This is the great inversion at the heart of medieval history, and it is why this whole journey has insisted again and again on dragging the invisible majority back into the frame, on following a ruined peasant family through the court rolls, on stopping to credit the women whose labour the chronicles ignored, on remembering that the brightly painted castle and the soaring cathedral and the wealthy company hall all rested, every stone of them, on the silent, unending work of people whose names we will never know. The story as it is usually told, the story of kings and knights and bishops and the glittering few, is not the story of the Middle Ages at all. It is the story of the very tip of the pyramid, mistaken for the whole of it. The real medieval world was the world of the labourers, and to find that world we cannot simply read the Grand Chronicles, because the Grand Chronicles were not interested in it. So the task, the genuine work of understanding this age, is to go looking for the traces of the invisible majority in the unglamorous places where they accidentally survived. It is to read the dry manorial court rolls, those long petty records of debts and dues and strayed pigs, because hidden in their tedium are the only glimpses we will ever get of how ordinary people actually lived and quarrelled and struggled. It is to look at the humble structures of rural life, the barns and the field patterns still faintly visible in the soil, the physical fingerprints of the people who worked the land. It is even to read the heraldry and the monuments of the powerful against the grain, recognizing that every coat of arms and every grand tomb is also, implicitly, a record of the thousands of unremembered hands whose labour paid for it. The 80% did not write their own story, so we have to reconstruct it sideways, from the records the powerful kept for their own purposes, listening for the faint presence of the people those records were never meant to preserve. They are there, in the margins, in the fines and the field strips and the foundations of every great building, the enormous absent presence underneath the whole of medieval history, and the work is to keep looking until we can see them. And there is one more place they survive, closer to us than any court roll or ruined barn, because the invisible majority left their fingerprints on something we carry around every day, our own names. A vast number of the surnames that fill the modern world are simply the trades and roles of medieval working people, frozen and passed down across the centuries. Every smith is descended, in name at least, from someone who worked metal at a forge. Every baker baked, every mason cut stone, every cooper made barrels, every weaver and fletcher and carter and shepherd announces, every time it is spoken, the humble occupation of an ancestor who laboured at it long before anyone thought to write a single word about him. The very chronicles that ignored the working people were written in an age that was, without quite meaning to, naming millions of them forever after the work they did. So the labouring majority is not as lost as it might seem. It is hiding in plain sight, in the field patterns under the grass, in the worn names of old streets, in the foundations of cathedrals, and in the surnames of half the people you will ever meet. A quiet, stubborn, everywhere presence that the Grand Record tried to forget and somehow never quite could. Because in the end, that is the honest answer to the question we began with, the question of what medieval life was like for every class. It was not one life, but four, divided so deeply that the people living them might as well have inhabited different worlds, sorted from birth into freedom or bondage, abundance or hunger, remembrance or oblivion, by nothing more than the accident of where and to whom they happened to be born. And the cruelest part of that sorting was the final one, the one that decided whose story would survive to be told, because the same system that gave the few their castles, and their mercy and their centuries of lineage also gave them something even more lasting. A place in the record, while it consigned the many, who carried the entire weight of that world on their backs, to a silence so complete that we have to strain across 700 years just to catch the faintest echo of their existence. The least we can do, now that we know to listen, is to remember that they were there. And on that thought, it is time to let the candles burn down and the fire settle into embers. Thank you for journeying through all 4 of these worlds with me, from the muddy field to the painted hall. Wherever you are listening from tonight, I hope you drift off thinking gently of those vanished millions who worked and dreamed beneath the same stars we still sleep under. Rest well now, let your mind grow quiet, and may you have the deepest and most peaceful of sleeps. Good night, and the very sweetest of dreams to you all.